There's a passing resemblance, no question.
Yeah. So anyway, when you're in Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, the oddest slogan I've ever heard. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, they say. Of course, it's not true. You can't kill a person and leave. They'll follow you across state lines and bring you back, and you'll face a jury of your peers. So I said, what does that mean? What does it mean? Like, what are they getting at, you know? I started ruminating about it. I whittled. I started whittling.
Oh, you whittle?
Yeah, when I ruminate, I whittle.
Whittle and ruminate.
Yeah, whittle.
Hand in hand.
And I said, what does that actually mean? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And it came to me in a sudden. What it means is you can have sex with a prostitute in Las Vegas, and she will not tell your wife. They're very discreet in Vegas. They're not like these gossipy small town whores. You know. These blabbermouths down at the beauty parlor with that pale blue thing over their head, whatever that is, go, you're Hank Johnson's husband? By God, I had sex in exchange for cash last night with him. Small world.
Yeah, in exchange for cash. Now, Norm.
Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll pass it off to James. I actually wasn't expecting to end right there, so I got jump scared by myself.
A shorter intro today. I always play that before a SHOT Show because it gets me in the mood for Vegas. All right, everyone, welcome to Redoubt.
Wait, aren't you married? What?
No explanation needed. Move on.
Oh my God. All right, fair enough. All right.
Gossipy small town horse. Gotta get away from it. All right. Welcome everyone to Redoubt. Today we are going to be going over a number of different arguments for God. We'll probably focus on tag or the transcendental argument because I've been on a bit of a Jay Dyer kick recently, and that's the argument that he uses. And I have a lot of appreciation for that form of argumentation, as well as some critiques. However, before we jump into that in more detail, I want to lay the groundwork for my own epistemology. And I thought one of the best ways to do that, or perhaps one of the most engaging ways to do that, would be to review an old video that I put out back in, 2018, 2017. We can look at the date once I pull it up. But this was back, my first attempt at YouTube. I am quite young and clean-faced. It's a little painful to watch, but yeah, that's me.
Oh, wow.
But I do think that it does. I was on to something even back then, and it helps give you a sense for the philosophical journey that I've taken over the years. And so I think the ideas that I lay out here will provide a good foundation for the continued discussion into the different arguments for God's existence, specifically tag, but even just arguments for motion and any of the other common arguments that you will hear. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Before we jump into that, Christian, how you doing tonight?
Good, sir. Went to confession and mass today, so feeling quite pious. So doing good.
There you go.
Excellent.
Pious signaling Christian.
Yep.
Literally pious signaling Christian right there.
Yep.
How long does confession normally take? What is that like?
That'd actually be interesting to go and do one day. How long does it take? Depends on the person. So some people treat it like a therapy session, and there's some people who treat it how it's meant to be treated, where it's just you're going in there and you're telling the priest your sins and you leave. And that's how I treat it. So it's usually like sub 5 minutes for me. Other people, it's like 10 to 15. So yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Well, good for you, John. How you doing today?
Good day today. Very, very tired. Last night I had an Iowa State match, which was the big level 2 match out here. I did the worst I've ever done in a match, so that was fun. Made it home super late after like a 5-hour drive, and went to church this morning, and I was half awake the whole time, so it was great.
Fantastic. I've had some Sundays like that.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Well, my wife wasn't feeling well today, so I did not make it to church. So I'm feeling less pious than either of you gents.
Mortal sin, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think it's okay if you're if for some reason you're sick or you still wanted to go but you couldn't go, right, Christian? Is that
No, that's not correct at all. You were 100% wrong.
Going to hell. Alrighty. Well, I put a poll in the chat, and I'm curious to see responses. And we can review that later. But the question is, do you understand the transcendental argument as Jay Dyer lays it out, if you have heard it from him? And hopefully we can convert any of the no's to yeses by the end of the stream. Because at the very least, what I want to do is make sure that we all at least understand the argument as it's being laid out. Okay, so a couple comments before we jump into this video. I want to real quickly just share my screen and give folks a background on my philosophical credentials, if you even want to call them that. I'm going to share something that I mentioned in the very first stream that we did, but it's what I call my works cited, and it is essentially just that. It's a collection of, at least on the topic of philosophy and theology, the various works that I have read, as well as lectures that I've audited. And the purpose of showing you this is not to brag about it. In fact, it's really the opposite. It is a somewhat long list by comparison to some people who haven't studied at all, but it's a rather short list when you were to if you were to compare me with someone like Jay Dyer or some of these people that have been doing this for much longer than I have. And so I'll go ahead and share the link to this in the description, so you're welcome to peruse it. But the two areas where I have focused mostly on are epistemology and apologetics, as well as church history secondarily. You can never fully understand church history because there's just so much there, and really epistemology is a little bit simpler, but you can't possibly have read every one that's written on epistemology, and so at some point you specialize even within that. So again, I'm sharing this list primarily because it's a rather short list, and so anyone who wants to challenge me can absolutely look through here and say, oh, well, I'm not going to bring up so-and-so, or if I am, at least recognize that I haven't, if it's not on this list, then I probably haven't been exposed to that person's thinkings. Although I will say that as I continue to study, I find that there aren't too many new ideas. There are categories of ideas and slightly different ways of phrasing things, but even as I've started to study Jay's particular formulation of the transcendental argument, there's nothing really new there from other ontological arguments that have been presented and that I have studied in the past. So that's a little introduction there. I think without any further ado, we can jump into the video.
All right, so now we get to see baby James.
When did you upload this, James?
Hey guys.
March 31st, 2018.
All right.
7 or 8 years ago. James Barrow here with Thoughts Matter. I've got my cup of tea. I am all ready to have a fun discussion. Today, it's going to be a direct message from me to you. We're going to talk about why we believe what we believe. We have two different ways of understanding the world. One way is through our conclusions. These are things that we determine logically. The other way is through our assumptions. These are things that we just take on faith. We don't have any logical reason for believing them. So these two types of beliefs cover all the beliefs that we have. Okay, so we're told that assumptions are bad. Right? If you assume, you make an ass of you and me. Okay. That's true to some extent. Here's the deal. Our conclusions have a place at one level. And I said that they flow logically, right? So if you trace a conclusion, you should be able to trace it back using like if-then statements, right? So, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this, and you get at your conclusion. So in order to go backwards, you say, here's my conclusion. Why? Why do I conclude this? And you jump back to your previous, what would have been your if-then statement to get here, and your if-then statement to get here. You ask why to go from here to here. And you say, why again? So I take this conclusion, and you say, why this? And eventually you're not gonna So we can speed it up probably a little bit as well. We can do at least 1.25. So on a note on this point, in terms of reversing deductions with the question why, this is a key insight, but it only works, it doesn't work necessarily. So in other words, the necessity of logic only flows in one direction. If to then, if this, then this. And if you're going to talk in terms of the perfection and the necessary propagation or continuance of a logical argument, it only flows in the direction of if then. You can ask why to go from then to if, but not in a way that is necessary. It's just a way to inspect the argument, just to understand why someone is making a particular argument. It's not like you can reverse it in a way that if you start with a particular conclusion, you can ask why and you will get necessarily to a particular set of premises. It's just a way of understanding what an arguer's set of premises are, having reached a particular conclusion, but why could get you to a number of different premises. It's not like there's a necessary connection. So asking why to reverse the logic chain isn't it would be a fallacy to say that asking why to a then statement would necessarily get you a particular if statement. That's a fallacy, I think, assuming the consequent or affirming the consequent, something like that. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it's a helpful way of inspecting your conclusion. If you have a particular conclusion and you ask why, then you can go from that then to your particular if statement.
Right, yeah, because you can't do that out in the wild to somebody else's. Right, it's more of an internal critique is what you're doing.
Yeah, or you can use it for someone else to understand their perspective. But
Have an
only
answer
they tell
for
you.
why. And that's where your assumptions should be.
So if you're assuming things at this level, right on par with your conclusions, that's an issue. That's when you're making an ass of you and me. But if your assumptions are down here and they are the basis of your conclusions, that's where they belong. That's the appropriate place for assumptions to be. Okay, quick name change here. We're going to start calling our assumptions postulates. That's the geometry term. For things that are self-evident. They're things that we take on faith. Okay, postulates goes all the way back to the Greeks when you have Euclid, father of geometry. And you might ask what his big contributions were. And it's not what you would think. He wasn't the one who came up with all the different geometry theorems that we use today. He simply took all these geometry theorems that were already proved. Well, I'm sorry, they weren't proved. They were already figured out. They'd already been observed. He took them, and he was the one who proved them. He said, "We've seen this to be true. Here's why we can prove that it is true." But guess what? Even he had to make some assumptions in order to do that. And they're called Euclid's postulates or Euclid's axioms. Axioms, postulates are basically interchangeable. Okay? So from the original 5 to 10 postulates that he had, we were able to get all the different geometry theorems that we have today. And Euclid played a very key role in determining that process of, okay, we make a few assumptions, and we base all of our conclusions on those assumptions. And he called them postulates, so we're going to call them postulates too. So we got two levels, right? The postulate level and the conclusion level. And you probably see me doing this with my hands. Let me explain what I'm doing. So the conclusion, I'm thinking of this as like a road, okay?
Today.
So if you've got all your conclusions are different destinations on that road, and those destinations follow these roads that lead back to a few basic assumptions, okay? Kind of at the center of this like at the hubs, right? Those are where all the roads kind of lead to, right? They don't all lead to the same one. They maybe have 3 or 4 or 5 or up to maybe 10 different assumptions at the center, and then all those conclusions flow from those. That's the diagram I'm kind of picturing in my head. And so we have 2 levels. We have the assumption level, we have the postulate level, and we have the conclusion level, okay? And the conclusion level is what I would refer to as like surface level. So when I say you need to go a level deeper in your thinking, that means ask why, get to a deeper level, and eventually the deepest level is the postulate level. Okay, so that just gives you a bit of an idea of kind of how I'm thinking about how we think rationally, how we think logically, what our process is. So again, to wrap up this segment, there are 2 kinds of beliefs, our conclusions and our postulates. And it should be that our conclusions flow logically from our postulates. All right, so pause it. This is just geometry 101, or this is 9th grade geometry. And basically the idea is that every conclusion that we have, if it's going to be arrived at logically, it will rest ultimately on certain assumptions. And this is true of everything in geometry, but it's also true of all conclusions, period. You cannot have any knowledge without assumptions. Certainly not any logical knowledge without assumptions.
What do you mean by logical knowledge?
The
Are you saying like justified beliefs?
No, I don't. We can go into justification. That's a separate topic. But when I say logical, I'm meaning deductive. So inference, deductive, logic, syllogism. These are all synonyms, and they're all the result. There are a number of different ways of talking about logic, but the way that I learned and I continue to use is that if-then formulation. So if this, then this. And if your assumptions are correct, if your premises are accepted, your premises and your definitions, which you may or may not consider to be part of your premises, but if you define things and people accept the definitions, and then you lay out your assumptions and they accept the assumptions, and then you do the logic correctly, then your conclusion cannot be denied on the basis of accepting these assumptions. And if someone does, so in geometry, the way it works is you'll have all these theorems, and certain theorems are going to be, their starting assumptions are actually other theorems. And so you go to those theorems and you look at how they were derived, and you can follow the chain back, and you can see that they had other theorems that they started from as well as their premises. And eventually you get to what are called properly basic premises, or what I'm calling postulates or proper postulates. And these are the axioms, the Euclid's 10 postulates that all of the theorems are ultimately based on. So they all can be derived back to these 10 postulates, as well as some other definitions, like the definition of a triangle and certain other statements like that aren't considered axioms, but they facilitate the logic chains. So that's so in geometry, that's how it works. And in terms of logical thinking, that is always how it works, right? All logical conclusions are reached on the basis of if-then statements or some other system that does the same task as what if-then statements do to get you to the conclusion. And if you accept the premises, then the conclusion must necessarily follow. But then the question is, why should you accept those premises? And if you take them back to the foundational level, then that's a really big question. Because if the reason why you accept certain premises is just because of other logical processes, that's fine, but those are not properly basic premises. So at some point you get to this foundation level, the properly basic beliefs, and that is ultimately what your worldview is based on. And so
why does this matter?
Rather
Why
incontrovertible. What I just said is just an explanation of how logic works.
Matter that we have conclusions that flow from our postulates. The reason why this is a very important structure in our thinking, this is a very intentional and strategical and practical way of organizing your thoughts, is that it centralizes where we might be wrong. Think about geometry again. As long as those 10, we'll just say there's 10 geometry postulates, as long as those 10 geometry postulates are correct, then all the different theorems that we show have to be correct, as long as the if-then statements are done correctly, as long as the logic is sound, right? As long as there's not an illogical or a fallacy that's being used in the chain, then the only point where we can be going wrong is the assumptions. So if the assumptions are true, the conclusions must also be true. It centralizes where we might be making a mistake. It centralizes where that error might be, and it allows us to pinpoint where we should focus on in our thinking. Okay, we know that this conclusion is right as long as this assumption is right, so we should then target the assumption to make sure that that's right. So it's very practical and strategical. And it works for other people too. If we can figure out what their assumptions are, then we can target those and say, I think this assumption is wrong. This is why I think you should adopt my way of thinking. Okay, so it helps in discussions, and it makes discussions that would otherwise be very impractical, very they wouldn't get you anywhere. You know, how many of you have just talked with a friend about politics or something, and you both come away thinking we didn't get anywhere. In fact, our relationship is worse now. That's because you probably were staying at the conclusion level. But if you get down to the assumption level, you can actually make a difference, because that's where you're going to potentially change someone's mind. Because if you're trying to target their conclusions, as long as their assumptions stay the same, they're never going to adopt your conclusions if they're starting from radically different assumptions.
Well, I think that a lot of debates do end up being, what do you call it, like a fact-finding mission, where you try and Like, so my scoreboard says 21 facts and yours only has 20, therefore like your worldview destroyed and mine
Right.
wins. This happens all the time, and not just in Christian debates, but in any sort of debate, right? Where you're like, well, if I pulled up these statistics that mean that I win or something. But the deeper level arguments, the paradigm level arguments, are where you can actually make headway and change, right? Because it's very difficult to, it's like trying to fix a video game, like if you're a developer that's already made, fully developed,
Right.
at the end stage of its production line. It's like, well, it's way harder to fix this product now versus in the design phase, which is kind of the same thing that we have here with arguments or beliefs.
Yeah, I think one thing I've had these conversations before, and using this method it's been so much more productive. I mean, imagine two people just having an argument on something like abortion, right? Something that's extremely morally charged, and one person's a Christian, one person's an atheist. They can throw facts at each other all day long about, viability and about, whether or not an infant feels pain or all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, you can admit or make someone admit that they were wrong on a particular fact, and so they may have lost the debate, but you're not going to have changed their mind unless you start to address some of the fundamental things. Now, you might be able to convince an atheist to adopt a pro-life position, but most likely the reason that person is pro-abortion, pro-death, is because of their atheism, because of their worldview that does not have a moral foundation. It just doesn't have any grounding. And so if you don't address the deeper underlying questions of morality and where does it even come from, then you're most likely not going to change their mind. And so the approach here is to actually try to dig deeper to someone's postulates. Now, in the case of an example of a discussion like that on abortion, you might just stop at the postulates about abortion. Get down to, let's say someone is talking about their standard of life is consciousness, and so then you've understood their basic assumption in terms of whether or not someone should be allowed to live, right, if they have consciousness. And so then you can start to apply the anecdotes and the statistics and the facts around that particular foundational belief. Even though that's not like a properly basic foundational belief, that's still a foundational belief to the argument of abortion. And so then maybe you can try to target why holding that standard of consciousness as being a definition of when someone should be allowed to live doesn't work. It isn't intellectually consistent and is flawed. And then maybe you can get them to change their position on that. But now that would be a productive discussion. But if you're just arguing at the conclusion level of whether or not abortion is okay or if it's wrong, then you're most likely just going to miss each other, regardless of how many stats you throw at them or how many facts. And the person who wins the debate might be the person with the most facts, but it doesn't matter who wins the debate if you haven't changed any minds. And the only way to change minds is to change their fundamental beliefs. And so the approach here is to first ask why until you understand their fundamental beliefs, and then try to change those. Don't start at the conclusion level and then just keep arguing at the conclusion level. Start by peeling back the onion, get to the foundation, and then argue at that level. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on, but that's the idea.
Right, and I think that a lot of people don't have like well thought out positions, especially in more normie circles. It's more of just whatever is topical in the moment. So like this guy says, you can't reason someone out of a belief they were never reasoned into in the first place. And which is why when you dig deep enough for a lot of these people, you very quickly find out that there is actually nothing underneath the surface level arguments or stats or feelings or whatever it might be. Like, especially when it comes to debating like atheists or even nihilists, like how do you convince a nihilist of like anything being better or worse is almost impossible to do. Good luck with that. But
getting someone to admit they're a nihilist is a huge step in the right direction. If you can actually get them to admit that, you most likely can't, even though their philosophy does naturally lead them to nihilistic presuppositions. And so that's a huge step. If you can get someone who doesn't live like a nihilist to admit that they are a nihilist, then now you're actually in a place where you probably can get them to change, because you can say, hey, look, you believe in nihilism, but why do you love your wife? Why do you do all these things that are not the natural outflowing of a nihilistic
Well,
tendency?
yeah,
You're
everybody's
clearly
a-
showing with your life
everybody's
that
a
you don't
nihil-
believe this. So why do you actually believe it? Why do you say that you believe this when you don't believe this? So then you can actually change their mind, because now you've reached a truly properly basic presupposition. I mean, nihilism is a valid belief system. It is you can properly believe in nihilism. You just happen to be wrong about everything, but you can do that and be justified in your belief. It's just horrible, and no one actually lives that way. And so you can.
Well, right. I mean, you might say that it has like some sort of logical through level, but I don't think anyone actually lives out a nihilistic life. Like, it's the meme of everybody's a nihilist until you point a gun in their face, and then suddenly their life has meaning. They want to see tomorrow. They want to see their kids. They haven't accomplished all the things that they want to accomplish yet. So while there might be some logical consistency there, I don't think that people
So there
don't
are
actually
terms
act
for
like-
this.
Yeah.
It's validity, strength, and then there's a couple other terms. One would be like compelling, or I mean, how convincing is it? And then the last one would be coerciveness. So essentially, if an argument is valid, that means that it's logically proper. The if-then statements are done in a way that, yes, it does necessarily follow from the presuppositions. If it is strong, that means that the presuppositions are strong, right? That the presuppositions are undeniable or very hard to deny. That's where a lot of arguments have issues, because people assume the strength of their presuppositions, sometimes correctly, but they assume that just because they're strong, that means they're certain, and that will get you into issues. And then also, sometimes people will just assume that they're strong and they really aren't. And so, but the question of how do you argue for the strength of a presupposition is a question that not enough people have seriously dealt with, at least in my experience. And so that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later. Then the other thing is how compelling is an argument? In other words, it might be strong, it might be valid. For instance, the transcendental argument is valid depending on how you state it. There is an invalid way to state it, but there's also a valid way to state it. And funnily enough, Jay kind of does both. He'll state the invalid way and the valid way. But there is a valid way of stating it. And so if you have a valid transcendental argument, great. And then the presuppositions are actually pretty strong in the valid formation. But then the problem is, once you stated the transcendental argument, which, as it was, the earliest conception of it, or one of the earliest conceptions, it's certainly not the earliest, but one of the most popular would be the ontological argument from Anselm, St. Anselm, although he didn't call it the ontological argument, but that's what it's been called. And it's that than God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And that's basically the argument. And there's a couple logical steps from there, but essentially you can stop there, and people look at you and say, huh? What does that mean? And you can show them why logically now you have to believe in God because I just said that, but they don't get it. It's not very compelling in that way. And so that's a third element of an argument. And then the fourth element is coercive. Is the argument coercive, meaning would any rational, intelligent person, if they actually understand the argument, be coerced into believing it necessarily? And some people think that there are coercive arguments. I think that there are not coercive arguments. I think that any argument can be rejected by intelligent people. For instance, you get someone like Bertrand Russell, who's a very intelligent man, but was an atheist. And, I don't think that it's because he didn't understand the ontological argument, or he didn't understand the transcendental argument. He just started from different wrong faith-based presuppositions. And that's why he was an atheist. And so that doesn't mean that, the presuppositionalists sometimes are put in a corner where they kind of have to say, they have to accuse people like that of being willfully ignorant or willfully unintelligent in a sense. And there's actually some truth to that. I don't have an issue with that statement so much. But, well, we can come back to that in a little bit. But basically, the idea that arguments can be coercive is an open question. And I would come down and decide that no argument is ultimately coercive. You can be intelligent and believe in bad arguments, because ultimately all arguments rest on certain faith-based presuppositions.
Arguments can't be coercive, as in they can't be convincing, or just the strength
Coercive
of the
means
arguments
that
themselves.
any rational person would necessarily have to accept it in order to maintain their rationality, assuming they understood the argument. That's what a coercive argument would be.
Interesting. And so you don't believe that exists in any way, shape, or form?
No. I think there are some very convincing arguments. I think that there are valid, strong, convincing arguments. I just don't think any of them are coercive. I mean, except for the presence of God, or something akin to the beatific vision, or like when Christ comes back, every knee shall bow, because at that point there will be no need for faith, right? That is the moment where faith as a prerequisite for knowledge will be removed. Now all of a sudden we can see, right? Faith is what is the Hebrews, or what is the line? Faith is the knowledge of things unseen, or something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing poorly, but essentially, faith is when you believe something even though you don't have proof for it. That's how I define faith: is belief without proof. And you can have a blind faith, which means belief without proof and without good evidence for believing in the thing, or you can have faith that is strong faith that has lots of supporting evidence, but is still faith nonetheless. It's still belief without certitude. And ultimately, I think all knowledge rests on faith of one kind or another, either blind faith or a strong faith. The question is what is your faith in, and how strong is it?
Fair enough.
Perfect timing.
So we've talked about two kinds of beliefs, talked about why it matters. I want to talk about two different types of reasoning as well. We have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So I'll start with deductive. Deductive reasoning, we're familiar with Sherlock Holmes. He deduces things. Deductive reasoning is that logic I described earlier, that if-then logic. If this, then this. Deductive reasoning is something that is a way to prove things. You can actually prove things deductively. Inductive reasoning is additive. In other words, it relies on volume. It relies on a volume of evidence. So you can't ever prove something inductively, but you can overwhelm someone with evidence to say, this must be right. I can't prove it logically, but I provide so much evidence that I can't see how this could possibly be wrong. Think back to geometry. One of the postulates is that all right angles are congruent. Okay, we've never seen a right angle that wasn't congruent. Therefore, we think that this is it's a valid assumption. But if it would only take one right angle to be not congruent with all the rest and still be a right angle, that would all of a sudden shake our belief in that postulate. And then it would cause all of our other theorems based on that postulate to come into question. So your belief in God, or your belief that there is no God, you have a lot of evidence to support that. If that's what you believe, you've got your group, your collection of evidence, and you add on to that and you keep collecting more evidence. And that's the only way that you can convince someone else that there is a God or there is no God, because you can't logically prove that one way or the other. So you have to rely on this additive form of reasoning, this inductive reasoning. So that's important to know the distinction between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning.
That's it. So this is huge. I mean, this is an insight that I had that I didn't even realize was an insight, and it's changed the way that I've thought about philosophy for the last 7 or 8 years. The separation between inference and evidence is I just can't stress it enough. You've got to realize that inference, being that logical chain, is built on assumptions. Just by definition, that's how it works. Everyone agrees on this. This is geometry 101. And then the question is, where do those assumptions come from? And my argument, so the foundationalist position, this is a philosophical position, is that these assumptions are self-evident. They basically attest to themselves. They are just so obvious that you have to accept them as dogmas, and every rational person will accept them, period. But over time, philosophers have challenged the various assumptions that people make and have started to disagree on these quote unquote self-evident terms. And so that whole concept has started to crumble, especially in a post-Kantian era where we can't really agree on the same self-evident presuppositions. And the whole idea of self-evidence, I think, is a misnomer. And actually, Jay agrees with me on this. We'll play some Jay clips in a little bit, Jay Dyer. And he doesn't much like the concept of self-evidence either. And that makes sense because he's a presuppositionalist. But the contention that I am making is that these quote-unquote self-evident assumptions they're faith-based presuppositions that are attested to by our experience, i.e., or through induction. And in induction, there's a great example of the difference between induction and deduction. And we'll get to Hume at some point in the future of this video, because Hume has a big critique of induction, which I actually wholeheartedly agree with. I think Hume was absolutely right on his critique of induction. And I think Hume would agree with me on this to some degree as well. But induction, just to define the terms, if you have a blue ball rolling out of a pipe every 30 seconds, you see this happen 10 times. On the 11th time, you think, okay, what's most likely going to roll out of the pipe? Probably another blue ball, and I would expect it to be, on the 29th second, I'm expecting in 1 second a blue ball is going to roll out of that pipe again. Okay, it happens. And now 50 times later, on the 51st time, 29 seconds, I'm thinking 1 second later, blue ball is going to roll out, happens again. Okay, great. Now 5 million times at the 29 second mark, I'm thinking, okay, 1 second, blue ball is going to roll out, and it happens again. Okay, great. Now I can now assume as a law of nature that a blue ball rolls out of this pipe every 30 seconds. Now, what Hume would say correctly is that you don't know that that's going to happen, right? An example that Hume uses is the sun rising tomorrow. You don't know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. You have no way of proving that the sun will rise tomorrow on the basis of induction, and he's absolutely right. But that doesn't remove the validity is not the right term for it, because I just defined validity in terms of logical concepts, but colloquially, I'll use the term validity, is a valid assumption because of induction. That's the only it's not a great, we can't prove it inductively, but it's all that we have is our experience that we can abstract from or induce that the sun will rise tomorrow, or having seen 5 million blue balls rolling out of the pipe every 30 seconds, we can assume with good evidence that a blue ball is going to roll out again in the next 30 seconds. But we can't prove it. And so that's my point. We have to take it on faith. But hopefully, in that case, it would not be a blind faith, but we would have no way of proving it. But as long as we're willing to forego certainty and say, yes, we can't prove it, we have to take it on faith that the blue ball is going to roll out, then we can still proceed with knowledge, and it is real knowledge, that the blue ball is going to roll out in the next 30 seconds. It's knowledge without certainty, which I believe all knowledge must be. And this is something that we'll get into a little bit later, but some people define knowledge as justified true belief. If you look up a definition of knowledge, the philosophical definition that it'll give is justified true belief. And I think that adding truth in front of belief for the definition of knowledge doesn't make any sense, and just assumes way too much. And then even that the term justified is a really iffy term in terms of what it actually means. And so I think that definition is flawed. But if you require all knowledge, anything that you're going to call knowledge, to necessarily be true with certainty, then you really, you just have no grounds of holding that. Yeah. A lot of balls.
Should have used red.
Yeah. Wait, so just according to this world, because I just have a couple questions here.
Yeah.
You can't have a justified true belief that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? We can't have certainty in that.
Absolutely not. In fact, I mean, pretty much anyone today will tell you that we can't, that we don't today, even scientifically, even just on induction alone, we think that stars die and the sun will die at some point.
Right, at some point, but that would also be a belief that we hold, that the sun will die one day. That doesn't mean that it's going to die tomorrow. That would be the nutty claim, right? But sure. I suppose what you're presupposing here is that we don't have like true justified knowledge that comes from God. So, like the transcendental argument goes.
I'm not
before
claiming that.
this.
I'm just claiming that the knowledge that we do have still rests
No,
on
you
faith.
are making.
We
You
cannot-
have to by definition make a claim that I don't know this.
All right, state your question again. I'm going to answer. it.
Okay.
Technically.
Well, so
This is
I'm
important.
just going to take the opposite approach and say,
I
actually,
can
no,
understand.
I do have justified faith that the sun will rise tomorrow.
I do too, and I have no issue with that statement. The question is, when you say true, I don't even really have a problem with true, except I have a problem with if your definition of the word true involves certainty. That's
Certainty,
the
yes,
issue.
certainty.
Yes,
I have
you
a
are certain that the sun will
justified,
rise
truth
tomorrow.
belief certainty
with
that the
certainty
sun
that the
will
sun will
rise
rise
tomorrow.
tomorrow.
Yes, correct,
So-
I do.
So philosophers would say that you don't. And pretty much all philosophers would say this, except for maybe some common sense philosophers. But the certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow depends on a number of other things as well, like the certainty that you are even you, that you have a self, that you're conscious, right? You can't be certain
Correct,
of
right.
those things. Now,
Yeah, but I'm going to presuppose all of that with the transcendental argument that it's divine revelation.
fine. But if you presuppose that, then those are your presuppositions, and you can't be certain of those presuppositions. Or can you? How can you be certain of those?
Well, again, my argument would just go back to divine revelation. So the transcendent argument is
Which
essentially
you have to have faith
all
in.
knowledge claims have to be based in God. I don't even know if you have to have faith in that, though.
You do.
Are you sure about that? Are you making a claim of certainty that I must know this?
I can.
This is where it's always funny to me, that this argument. So if you take the building blocks of tag is essentially saying that because logic exists, because like math and other things exist within the universe, it must come from a source. That source is God, which is the ultimate truth, divinely revealed
Which I
to
agree
us.
with all of that. I have no issue.
No,
with any
I
of
know
that.
I know you do, but the
That is my
Kantian
position.
not sure element is funny, or there's the argument against the certainty to me, right?
Right. Well, so, and so to go to just briefly on the self-defeating
Well,
nature.
as a Calvinist, do you have certainty in your salvation?
Not in an epistemological logical certainty like that. I mean, even Calvinists generally don't view certainty that way. Don't view assurance that way. But I have assurance of my salvation. I don't really have an issue with that.
Well,
And
do you?
it depends on what you mean by
Are you
assurance.
certain? I mean, do you have a justified knowledge claim for that?
Well, yes. Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. My justification is the same as yours. I believe that justification comes from God and His revelation. Right.
Are you sure about that?
No. That's what
Well,
I'm saying.
at some point you have to say no, and I just have to say like yes.
But you're lying.
Well, no, I'm not. Not from my worldview. All knowledge must, by definition, depend on God from the transcendental argument.
I agree. All knowledge does depend on God. The transcendental argument, which is a good argument, if
Well, yeah,
done
but are
correctly.
you sure about that?
No. But
Well,
neither are you.
that's where we come back to it again. I'll let it go for now, but it is funny to me, and I like messing with you in that way.
But it's like, what's the point of an argument if it's not coercive, right? Because what you're saying isn't coercive. You can't convince anyone else. You can say that you're certain, but I don't believe you. I could be
Well,
wrong.
but I
on
don't
that.
know if
I
I don't know
fully
if it
admit that. I could
rests
be
on
wrong.
coercion.
Maybe
I
you
don't-
are certain, but to me, I am assuming, as a faith-based proposition, that we do have some shared sense of rationality and understanding of the world, and just based on our conversation, I think there's plenty of good evidence to believe that, right? So again, these are based on faith-based assumptions. But if your experience is at all like mine, then I can say, no, you're not certain. Now, that isn't, I don't know that your experience is like mine. I don't know that you are, so that's an assumption I have to make, and I'm certainly willing to make it, and we have to make assumptions to have knowledge at all. And again, that's just basic geometry,
Right,
just basic
but
logic. We have to have assumptions.
even if my argument isn't coercive, which I don't think that it necessarily has to be, you would have to make an absolute statement that my statement or my belief is not absolute.
Right. So this is what I want to get to, the self-defeating nature of a lack of certainty or belief in a lack of certainty. People will say that it's a self-defeating argument because if someone says, well, I don't know anything, we'll say, well, then that's the one thing that you know, is that you can't know anything. But that's not a necessary position that someone who claims you can't know anything has to hold. If you ask them, well, can you know that? They can say, no, I don't know that either. Again, just continuing to show that I do not know with certainty anything. All of my knowledge, all knowledge, period, but certainly at least speaking for me, as far as I do know, which is based on faith-based assumptions, all of my knowledge is based on faith-based assumptions. And yes, I'm speaking from personal experience, so I'm psychoanalyzing myself, and so I can't with certainty apply that to anyone else. But on the basis of my assumptions, then I can work from there. In order to go anywhere logically, in order to progress at all intellectually, you have to start with certain assumptions. No one can get around that, or at least I can't. And so it's not self-defeating, and it's not it is non-coercive.
Would you call it circular?
No. Would you?
Well, I don't know. From my perspective, the argument, the Kantian perspective, that you can't be certain that you know.
Careful about calling
anything.
it a Kantian perspective, because Kant gets misused all the time. And Kant
Well,
did
okay. Well, let's
actually
say
believe in certain-
you're not sure. You are sure that you're not sure that you know anything, and you know that for sure.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
But you aren't sure that you are sure that nothing can be sure.
I am not epistemologically certain of anything, including the fact that I'm not epistemologically certain of
Okay,
anything.
right. So that's the thing. So
That's
if
included in
you
there.
aren't certain that you aren't certain,
Then I could be wrong.
Are you certain that I can be certain? Your answer has to be, I am not certain. So you arguing against me from a defeated position.
I'm
Or
arguing
it's like
against you from an
from
uncertain
your
position.
perspective, you can't possibly defeat my position because you aren't sure.
That's the critique, right? The critique is that it's just useless, but it's not self-defeating. But you can argue that it's useless.
I mean, I get that it's not self-defeating on that sense, because your argument is simply I don't know, so I don't know that I don't know that I don't know, basically. So that just, what is that? Not self-defeating,
It's not even
but
circular.
like,
it's just I don't know.
well, you're not sure. Are you sure that it's not? That's just, I gotta stop.
Stop.
Do I think that people really follow this chain of thinking? You know, this assumption, all of our conclusions flow from that. Do I think that that's actually how our minds work? I don't know. I go back and forth. I think it is. I mean, I think that it's an assumption that I am making because it's a useful assumption, whether or not it's true. And there is evidence to say that people aren't necessarily rational. I think that people, whether they know it or not, they do have a few things that they believe that their conclusions flow from. And I say this because in my personal experience, I was able to identify what those few beliefs are. And so I think that it's true. There is plenty of evidence to say that people aren't necessarily rational. I think of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. These are two Israeli psychologists that dedicated their life's work to showing that people are not always rational. But even in their experiments, they found that when people were presented with the rational thing that they should have missed, or they should have caught, you know, they may have made an error when presented with this problem, but when they were shown the solution, they were like, oh yeah, I can't believe I made the mistake. That kind of tells me that people might not be rational always. They might not always act rationally, but they can at least identify what rationality is and what logical thinking should be, which I think is evidence of this, that this conclusion, postulate, model works.
That's going back to that earlier topic that we were talking about, how some people, they've just reached conclusions without ever going through a rational process. And I totally understand that. But I do think that you can very often, by asking why, even reveal to them what the rational process was. And even if it's not, even if they reached it through an irrational process, which is possible, I think very often it's more helpful to assume that the person across the table from you is rational and has, even if they don't realize it, has reached their conclusions through a semi-rational process or something that's sort of subconsciously rational. And very often by asking why, you can figure out what that is, even if they didn't realize it beforehand. And so that's what makes it a fruitful conversation, because now they know more about their own position than they did when they sat down.
Right. So I think that there is something there because even in economics, we did a study about like people would obviously make the best decisions for themselves, right? Financially and through whatever means that they have access to, and the answer is no, they simply don't. Right? But
yeah.
they, from their perspective, in the moment, they are making things that appear to be rational given their like momentary minute to minute needs, desires, wants, that sort of thing. Even if they can't rationalize it, they can still recognize either after the fact that what they did was rationalized in a certain way. Like we've all made bad decisions, but in the moment we were like, oh, this is either, even if we weren't thinking about it, like this makes rational sense because of X, Y, or Z.
You were probably interacting in economics class with these two Israeli psychologists that I mentioned, because most of their work was done, at least their groundbreaking early work
It's
was
possibly,
done
but I don't
in
even remember their
economics.
names.
Well,
I don't
can just
remember the
tell you.
names of them. I probably have the books sitting in a binder out in the garage somewhere. It's in like a huge crate out there, basically. But yeah.
When I was young, I was afraid of conflict. I was worried that someone else debating with me about something that I believed very strongly in, that I would hear some arguments from them that I never thought about and that were very convincing, and that I might be convinced. And so when I found myself in those situations as a kid, I would think, okay, this person tells me this, that I know I don't believe or I don't agree with them, but I don't know why I don't agree with them. So now I've got to go read a bunch of stuff that confirms my beliefs. And this is how most of us go through life. We know that we have these vague beliefs about life, but even when we hear very convincing arguments on why they're not true, we think, well, I still believe them, and I've still heard some equally convincing arguments for why they are true, so I'm going to go and read those and then and believe those because that's what I believe, right? Why did we do this? As a kid, I could recognize that this wasn't intellectually honest, and so it was something that scared me. Conflict like that concerned me. I didn't know how to get out of that cycle of the person who reads the most and knows the most facts about their argument, they win the argument. In other words, truth is determined by how much you know about your argument. Well, that's not true. Truth is not determined by how well or how good of a debater you are or how much you've read. Truth is truth, and people should be able to have discussions regardless of how much they've read. If they've been thinking about some of these issues, they can still help bring people along in a journey to discover what truth is without having read more than the other person, without having knowing more facts, more anecdotes, more statistics. These are things that aren't what determine truth and are often not helpful in getting at truth. So to end this
you saw a
story,
great example of this where you have someone that is relatively uneducated, like Focus Trip, interrogating me, just simply asking why or asking the people questions,
What?
and he's able to.
What?
Jeez.
What? I have a college degree. I never used it, but I have a college degree. What are you talking about? Damn.
James, you're gay. All right, don't bash
Fine.
on like
All
that.
right. We're gonna play
Not
back
actually
that
gay.
opening section about you talking about your wife in Vegas and that Norm joke. Okay, that's what we're gonna play again.
Over and over.
But that's the thing. James doesn't even know if that's really his wife. No, I'm just kidding.
I realized that the reason I wasn't convinced by someone else's better arguments or arguments that I'd never heard before was because they conflicted with my postulates. And that realization has made all the difference, recognizing that the reason these people have these arguments that sound convincing at a conclusion level, and I might not be able to argue at a conclusion level, but I can still disagree with them and be totally justified in disagreeing with them because I recognize that their assumptions, that their postulates are different. And if they have a different set of postulates, they will naturally arrive at a different set of conclusions. That realization was very comforting because I'm no longer afraid of conflict. If I disagree with someone, I'm very interested in knowing what their assumptions are. Because then I can say, oh, we have totally different assumptions, so it makes sense that we disagree. If we have the same assumptions, the same postulates, and we still disagree, that concerns me. Then either I've made a logical mistake or they have. And we can both grow from going through that process and figuring out which one of us has made a logical error. So all in all, this type of this way of recognizing, this way of thinking about human rationality really does make a difference in how we go about discussions, and it makes a difference in how we approach conversations. We're no longer ruled by how much we've read. We're no longer controlled by the anecdotes and the statistics that we have to back up our beliefs. We don't have to rely on those anymore. So where do these come into play?
Well, and I think that's where a lot of people get stuck at. especially before they think deep. Like, I'm sure we were all or knew a lot of people, college age men and women, who thought that they knew a lot because they had studied like one specific topic. And so they had learned the factoids. And so they're like, I am well versed in this, and this is what I believe because my college professor also believes this. But again, they have no actual like basis or foundation for their beliefs. It is actually just arguing factoids among each other.
In a form of discourse that I'm describing in this video. You know, I'm talking about getting back to your postulates. Well, it seems like you don't need anecdotes or statistics in that form of discussion. So should you just no longer use them at all? Not quite. So you shouldn't use them at first, but they come in handy later. So at first, when you're going from conclusions to postulates, yeah, don't use them. Put them aside. Put aside your anecdotes and your statistics until you and the person that you're talking with both know where your assumptions lie, where your postulates are. Once you've identified your postulates, then bring those anecdotes and those stats back on the table, because those are your inductive arguments. Those are the things that you use to make someone lose faith in one idea and adopt faith in another. That's the only thing that can happen at the postulate level, right? You can't use logic. You have to use inductive reasoning. No deductions, only inductions.
This isn't Kant, by the way.
So I've made it through my cup of tea, so I know it's about time.
Long before
Every time somebody brings up Kant, you're like, no, it's not Kant. It can't be.
I'm not a Kantian. Like,
The Kantian slander will continue until morale improves.
This video. The ultimate goal here was to, yes, explain to you my theory on human rationality, to explain to you, this whole idea of conclusions versus postulates, of deductive versus inductive reasoning. But the ultimate goal is to get to this point where I can give you what I'm calling the postulate challenge. The postulate challenge is a challenge from me to you.
Do you want to go through this postulate challenge? Basically, James, in the last 4 minutes of this video, asks you, the viewer, to write down like your 10 postulates or boil down to your base foundational beliefs, whatever they might be.
and at the time when I made the video, I had a sense for what mine were, but I wasn't confident enough to say them. I can't ignore it. I wasn't confident enough to say them in the video, but I can tell you now what they are. And but first, there's an example that I give in this video that I think is actually very helpful, and we don't have to play it. I'll just give it to you live. But essentially, when you're doing this process of trying to figure out what your core assumptions are, you start with a conclusion and you just ask why until you get to a conclusion. And I would have thought going into this process, like, oh, surely there'd be some rather long, complex logic chains that, require a lot of dissection, and this would be a long process. And it turns out, no, not really. You can take basically any conclusion, and the chain will probably be a lot shorter than you think. So one that I like to give is, I've got this little earbud here. If I drop it, it'll fall. Okay, I dropped it, it fell. Now, why? Now, and as a conclusion, I could tell you before I drop this that I believe it will fall. And so you say, why? And I tell you, well, gravity. Okay, and then the next question is, okay, why do you believe in gravity? And, well, because the laws of nature. I was like, okay, fine. Well, that's really just sort of restating it. Gravity is one of the laws of nature. Why do you believe in that? And for me, I'd have to just say, because I think that God put the laws of nature in place. And so in like 2 steps, 3 if you want to stretch it out, you could do more if you wanted to, but there's really no point. You're just sort of restating the question. You get to one of my properly basic beliefs, a belief in God, a creator that established these laws. And so I would just encourage you to do this process of start with just any random conclusion that you have and ask yourself why. If you believe in, that abortion is a human right, ask yourself why, and then
ask yourself what a right is.
Yeah, right. Well, exactly. I mean, that will come up, and you might learn some things about yourself. But I'll just tell you, my 2 presuppositions are 1, belief in God, and 2, belief in Scripture as being the inspired Word of God. And I have not found a way to separate those 2 or to supplant one with the other. I can't put God underneath Scripture, and I can't put Scripture underneath God. I mean, the God that I know and believe in is revealed in Scripture, right? So it seems almost like I would put Scripture below God. Like, Scripture is my properly basic belief in its inspiration. It's verbal and plenary inspiration as the sort of Westminster Confession phraseology of it. But that's not true. That's not a more properly basic belief than my belief in God, right? I don't believe in God because because I believe in Scripture. I believe in God and Scripture at the same properly basic level. If someone was to show that my understanding of the verbal and plenary inspiration of Scripture is incorrect, right? That my view of inerrancy is incorrect, and actually Scripture has 7 more books than I thought it had, or actually several sections should be taken out, or they were written.
It actually has 13 extra books.
Is there 13 more books? How many? Is there?
Well, 7 for the Catholic canon, 79 for the Orthodox. Well,
okay.
The Orthodox Study
Gotcha.
Bible, I think, is 79.
Okay, all right.
Could be wrong about
So,
that.
anyways, let's say there were whole sections of it that actually aren't infallible. Whatever. The point is, if those things were specifically challenged, my belief in God doesn't go away. It might be shaken, but those are 2 separate legs of the ladder, and so. So that's for me. I think Catholics basically, I've made this argument before, have to hold to a 3-legged stool where it's Scripture, God, and the authority of the Church all being at the same level. I don't really think they can get away with putting the Church at a higher level than those two, for the same reason as I kind of laid out there for why those two have to be at the same level. And my argument for why Sola Scriptura is valid historically even, and my argument for why the Reformation makes sense, is that at one point the Church did hold that 3-legged stool, and at one point the third leg, the leg of the faith, at a properly basic belief in the authority of the Church as the infallible interpreter of Scripture, at one point, specifically in the 1500s, the point of the Reformation, people's faith waned in that as being a valid presupposition, and they were left with the remaining 2 legs, and that's what they had to proceed with, and those are the 2 legs that I hold, that I hold to, and that's just in keeping with my Protestant lineage. So that's the postulate challenge. That's the theory of rationality as I laid it out, very much incomplete, and there was tons there that needed to be further explained. But like I said, even 7 or 8 years ago, there's nothing in that video that I would go back on, and I have since then developed and clarified the ideas a lot more, but in a way that's where it all started, and even before then it started in 9th grade geometry when I just kind of started to take some of these where I started to form this epistemology without even realizing that I had formed this epistemology. So I think the next thing is to start to contrast it, because hopefully it makes some sense to people. Although I do want to do the reverse with you, John, in terms of getting to understand your perspective and why you do think that you can be certain in certain things, because I think that is the best counterpoint to what you were doing to me. But then I want to, it's only fair. But then I do want to get into the other epistemological views, because Jay Dyer does hold a different epistemological view, sort of. There's so much that we agree on. It's not even really
Well, it's weird because while tag is a different argument, you guys still basically agree on everything. But for me, I think tag is a very good argument against not necessarily other Christians, but like atheists or Gnostics.
Whereas
And
I
that's
would
where
say
I
it's
think it's the
basically a
strongest.
better. I don't know. I'm not. It can work
Because
against them.
for atheists, they don't have like any justification for their beliefs outside of like sense data. I guess really that's their only fallback is sense data as a foundation for everything. But from the tag, we go way behind that. We just before you can even have knowledge itself of anything, any justified beliefs is God.
Yeah. All right. So, John, why do you think that you can't have any certain knowledge?
Because I have knowledge, which presupposes God.
Okay, I believe that you have knowledge. I mean, and I, even when you were asking me, I knew that what you were saying was certain knowledge. But if you just said knowledge, then I could say yes. But how is your knowledge certain? How can your knowledge be certain?
So if we accept that there is things like logic, math, things like that, if we accept that these things do actually exist,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason for those things existing stems from God.
Right. So in terms of the way Jay will talk about it, say that a necessary one of the
It's a
necessary
necessary.
ingredients for logic is God. Therefore, God exists. Right. It's kind of like he uses the argument of if you bake a cake, then the necessary ingredients for baking a cake are by virtue of being necessary. If you have a cake, then you have the necessary ingredients present in some form, or they also existed. Right. If you have logic, then you have God. But how do you know that middle statement of God being a necessary, being necessary for logic?
So I mean, I wouldn't even. I would take it one step further back from that. There is cake, therefore there was a baker.
How do you know?
Because there is cake, which presupposes that somebody made that cake.
I don't think that's that's not really a transcendental argument, though. That's more of a argument for motion, where
it's there is logic. The logic stems from God. Logic being cake. In this
right, but you still
analogy.
but how do you know that God is the only possible that God is the only possible explanation or only valid explanation for logic?
Only valid explanation for logic.
Right, because I mean, atheists will tell you, they will make all kinds of arguments for why they can develop logic without God. Why we could have gotten logic without God.
Without God, you would have to say that it's random, though.
Yeah. So I mean, this is how I think tag works effectively. Is if basically you can show that the atheists accounting for logic doesn't make sense. It ultimately can't really get you there. And so what that is, it's a reductio ad absurdum argument. You can show that the atheist position reduces to absurdity. But I don't think, but that is,
But yeah,
that's
logic
not the
itself,
same thing as positively proving your position with certainty.
right? But
You can disprove all the other positions, but in theory, there can be an infinite number of other positions. Now, you can categorize them and say, well, there's only really a certain number of worldviews, even though there might be an infinite number of positions with their nuances. They really all fall into like 5 categories, and so as long as you can disprove all the other 5 categories, and the only remaining one is the Christian position, which I'm totally fine with that. I think that's a great, form of argumentation, and it works for some people. My point is, if you can't positively prove that one position, you still haven't created a coercive argument. You have just done a reductio ad absurdum argument, which is
so when
fine,
you keep up bringing the coercive argument, but we already believe that people aren't necessarily fully rational. So
if you
even
believe
if
in
I
certainty,
did,
you would have to believe in. Well, it seems like certainty and coercive arguments should go together. I guess you could believe in certain knowledge without believing in coercive arguments, but I'm not sure.
Well, right, but I'm also interested from your worldview when you're critiquing tag. Right, you're presupposing that somebody can't be certain of something, which would be a certain belief.
Why? Why would it have to be certain?
Well, because like you said that I have knowledge of things, but not certain knowledge of things, like
that's how I would say it about
beliefs.
that. Yeah, I would say that I'm presupposing.
But that
things.
would have to be, a certain claim from your worldview.
It's just based on faith. At some point,
so you have faith. Okay, all right. No, I see what you're saying.
Like
there,
even
for
for
sure.
you, if you say, I mean, I'm assuming this is true for you. I can't get inside your head, but if you say I have certain knowledge from God, that's a faith-based statement, right?
I mean, you could view it that way, but I don't.
You can't
think
logically.
of it that
Okay,
way.
well, it depends on how you define faith, but I would define faith as belief without proof, and you cannot logically prove that you have certainty. That you have certain knowledge. You cannot logically prove it, right? Transcendental arguments are not logically valid if they're done circularly, and they're not.
But you keep on talking about logic as if from the transcendental argument, logic does not presuppose God.
So there are 2 ways to do transcendental arguments. There's a circular way, and then there's a way that has a presupposition that's not God. In which case, that's your presupposition. So, in other words, your presupposition is that God is a necessary part, or is the only explanation for logic. That's your base presupposition. Therefore, God exists, right? You start from somewhere and you get somewhere else. You can do it that way. That's not circular. It's totally valid. But you still have to. Now you've got to defend why God is the only way that you can
Right,
do
but I
logic.
could even take the circular argument and then just ignore
Well, then it's just not logically valid. Then it's just fallacious, and so that's fine. But you still haven't proven anything in a way that would negate the faith aspect of it, right? Once you have a circular argument, you're just going in circles. You have to just accept. You know, a circular argument is when you assume the conclusion, right? Which doesn't. It's fallacious. It's not. It doesn't get you anywhere. You'd be better off if you just assumed the assumption. Why assume the conclusion? Just assume the assumption and call it an assumption. Call it a presupposition. That's what it is. It's a faith-based assumption. There's no reason to go in a circle. Don't call it a conclusion.
Well, I think
just call
I
it an
think that
assumption. And that's fine.
there
That's
is a
valid.
reason to do that because like I have a certain belief that we are currently arguing right now. Like that is actually a certain belief that I hold. So I am totally fine with the reason that we can have any knowledge whatsoever, or that we believe that which we both believe that logic exists, does, if you follow the tag argument, follow back to God.
Yeah, if you.
So
believe
you can
that
call
God-
you can call it circular, if you
No,
would
it's
like
not
to.
circular the way you just said it. But we both have to believe, which I do. I agree with you. But it is still a faith-based belief that God is is the only necessary explanation for logic. That's the faith-based belief in that.
But if
logical
not the
deduction.
way you just said it though, the way you just said it is the only. If it is the only, then it doesn't even have to be faith-based.
Yeah, it does. Why not?
The only possible answer has
How
to
do
be
you know
faith-based.
that he's the only? Yeah. How do you know that?
Well, you don't. I do.
How? How?
Well, divine revelation.
Okay, sure. Divine revelation. You're telling me divine revelation doesn't require faith?
No, because it's like you could go like the I think therefore I am type of thing.
Which
it's
isn't
like
actually logically valid either.
But you're when you talk about logic again, when we're talking about tag. Logic has to come from God.
Okay.
Hmm.
I don't have a problem with that, but that's a presupposition. That's the thing that you're putting your faith in. How do you know that?
Well, it's because if I can know anything, it comes from God.
How do you know that?
Well, we're just going to keep saying the same thing over and over again. It's like if I believe that there is
Say
justifiable.
by faith. That's the answer. The answer is by faith.
Well, no, but I know that there is though, right? Because if I
You know
believe that
it
there
by
is
faith.
truth comes from God. See, but the other way you would look at
How do
it
you know
is if you
that?
it's I don't know. We're not going to solve this way. I don't think. I think it might help us to listen to Jay on this,
Yes.
but because I think he's going to do the argument better than I can. Because
Not
I don't
really.
even
No,
fully
it's the same
understand
thing.
the argument. I don't even fully understand the argument. To be clear, I'm
Fair
doing
enough.
the best I
Yeah.
can with tag. But yeah. I mean,
All right.
I would. It boils down to because I believe in truth that truth has to come from somewhere, like whether it's logic or mathematics, or you have like theoretical number sets that exist, but we can't prove that they exist. Stuff like that. There's this really weird number set. Like I don't understand that argument. That's above my pay grade. But there's things that we can know exist without
okay.
actually being able to understand them.
But again, going back to the concept of knowledge, if you agree with my definition of faith as unproven belief, then you have to accept that your tag argument ultimately is based on faith, because it cannot be proven in a logically valid way. Therefore, it has to be based on faith. If you accept that definition, which you don't have to, but I think.
Well, but are you
we were
just
driving
saying
before on the
faith like
definition.
within your own mind, right? Because if
I don't know who else's mind it would be.
well, right. So if we're how do I explain what I'm thinking here? So basically my wheels are spinning. I'll think about it.
My wheels have been spinning the past
Okay,
hour.
we can pull up a J clip. There
Okay.
was something else I wanted to do before we did that, but I can do it in between.
Well, we're an hour and 15 minutes in, so we'll see how far we make it. So this is the transcendental argument for God for
Okay.
them
Them
slow
slow
boys, which I believe is a compilation.
I was not raised in the church, and I basically developed on atheism due to just a lack of anything else. How is it? I don't think it is possible to convince somebody who is in that situation and also is a logical person who relies on rational arguments to come to conclusions. Basically, what I'm saying is I don't have a lot of faith points to just take somebody's word for it that there is a God, that Jesus Christ is that God, and all the other things that go along with that. How can it? Do you believe it is possible to convince somebody like that?
First and foremost, no, I do think that there is logical, demonstrable proof for the Christian God. I think the transcendental argument is a valid, sound, logical argument. I think that the argument is itself about the status of logic and reason itself. So no, I would not ask a person to believe Christianity just simply on hearsay or because somebody claimed to have had XYZ experience. I mean, it's not necessarily wrong to believe on the basis of hearsay because, I mean, somebody could, as the examples I gave earlier, you could believe in something true for bad reasons. So plenty of Christians are convinced of Christianity for bad reasons. I mean, we see that with the classical arguments. I mean, they're bad arguments, but they do work at times to convince people for the wrong reasons. However, when it comes to the truth or falsity of the positions themselves, I mean, that's a separate issue.
One of the classical arguments, this is what I was saying earlier, John, where you were saying, why does anything exist? That's one of the classical arguments. I think Jay would call it a bad argument. So this is why I'm trying to. It's hard to make progress because the terms are so confusing and they get rather technical, but they're not even that technical. It's just that there's so many different ways of talking about things. That's almost the problem. Is there's a lack of agreed upon technical language where you can talk about the same thing with completely different words, and it makes it rather convoluted.
However, when it comes to the truth or falsity of the positions themselves, I mean, that's a separate issue even from bad arguments about the position. So I would say, and that would be the fallacy, right? Just because something's badly argued doesn't mean that it's necessarily true or false. So
and there's the same with atheists. A lot of atheists become that because of emotional reasons.
Sure. Well, my first response would be, no, actually, I would make a logical, rational argument for Christianity and for the Christian God. And the argument would be that logic and reason themselves are impossible without the Christian God. So that's the transcendental argument in short. So when you say things like, and I'll let you have the floor in a moment, when you say things like that it's morally superior, perhaps, to have sort of Christianish values, but that logic and reason is kind of the domain of atheism or science, is what at least what it sounded like you're saying. I would say, no, I think to the contrary. I don't think that atheists can give an account for a justification for logic and reason at all.
My account for reason would be that my brain is essentially a sophisticated computer that has arrived at these abilities that are useful for the environment that I'm evolved to be in, and intelligence and reason and mathematical spatial relations, all that are a part of that.
So let's back up here. So are you saying that the spatial relations and the things that you perceive in the world are only in your brain, or are they actually metaphysically existing realities out there in the world?
I would assume that the world is actually real and that we're not all in the matrix, but I wouldn't say that I can prove that to be the case. I just reject nihilism a priori.
Right. But you mentioned a series of things in this description. You mentioned the brain, quote unquote. You mentioned that it's, quote, sophisticated, which suggests levels of complexity as opposed to things that are non-complex or simple. You mentioned that it had progressed in the sense of evolving. You mentioned objects in the external world, which, again, kind of presupposes a lot of metaphysical categories like an external world, which you mentioned there. You mentioned the ability to perceive objects, which suggests that there's identity over time in objects, that words have meaning, that there is objective truth value in propositions. And so what I'm getting at here is not just to spit out a bunch of phrases or arguments, but that all of those things kind of require a structure to epistemology and to metaphysics. Would you agree or would you not?
I would say that you can. So yes, they must physically exist, all these objects that are being perceived. And then all the categories that relate to those things or describe those things, I would say those could be invented by intelligent observers.
Okay, so you think that numbers, logical laws, the external world, time and space are merely invented by us?
I would say that they are descriptions for patterns that exist in nature.
Oh, so wait a minute. So exist, that's metaphysics.
Granted.
Okay. Go ahead.
So somebody didn't just arbitrarily decide numbers and, well, if somebody made that based on no external observations or reality, then other people would not go along with it. But we all agree that two things are two things and three things are three things, and and that a cat.
Right. So this is a much better explanation that I could do. So he's talking about there are things that even somebody who doesn't, who's relying purely on sense data, believes do actually exist, like metaphysically exist, like we believe rocks and computers and things like this, like actually exist in the objective world outside of our brain, right? If you take that, then there is objective truth, right? Then there is certainty of existence of whatever it might be, which is part of tag.
Sorry, explain that.
Well, so we believe things metaphysically really exist, truly exist, are outside of our own mind.
As a presupposition.
Well, I'm just saying that is a belief that are you sure that things exist outside of your own mind?
As a presupposition, yes.
Well,
I mean, that's what Jay would say. And that, I mean, I would agree with that, but I would just say that it's faith-based. And I don't know if Jay would agree with that or not.
Interesting. Okay.
Is a little bit like a dog and less like a cactus.
Okay, so if we all agreed that numbers were the opposites of themselves, or that would that actually objectively change the numbers, that the principles that are being reflected?
Not.
Okay. Well, I thought you just said that it was because we all agreed on it.
It's not because we agree on it. We agree on it because it is self-evidently true.
Oh.
Or we can observe that it is true.
How do you know that observations are self-evidently true? I mean, can we misinterpret our observations?
Yes, but
Okay.
I have to assume.
So how do we know that we aren't misinterpreting our observations in these cases of things that you're saying are self-evident?
Because if that is the case, then basically nothing that I think or see I can take as at face value or true. And if that's the case,
So it's self-evident.
then,
So that's circular.
so I assume I'm taking it as an axiom that nihilism is not true, that there is some truth in the world and we can observe it, and that our observations aren't completely illusory.
Right, but what I'm pointing out is that that's
You're
not
right. I can't give an account for why that is the case.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what we got to do when we believe in these things, is give an account for them, because nobody wants to believe in something irrational. Nobody wants to believe in something that they can't give an account for. But remember, point two that you made was that, nobody should be asked to believe in something that they don't have a good logical, rational account for. So I've heard you believe in a lot of things that now you're saying, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
So that is the transcendental argument in terms of how it's actually used, at least that's how Jay will use it, is the only thing that gives a valid account for logic, for our experiences, for these things that we do hold to be self-evident. Jay doesn't like the term self-evident, and he'll explain that in another clip. But if you're going to call them self-evident, these things that we just assume, the only thing that gives a rational explanation for them are these certain presuppositions. And I think that's it's a good argument. The thing is, it's a reductio ad absurdum argument. It's not a positive proof. It's I'll reduce all of the other possible arguments to absurdity, but you never actually show positively in a way that proves your position that your position is valid. And that is ultimately where the presuppositionalist view takes you. That is how presuppositionalists practice their apologetics, if they're going to be consistent. And I mean, I think that's what Jay does. And so it's a step beyond the tag, but it is the natural endpoint of tag, because tag doesn't work logically. It doesn't work deductively. You either go in a circle, or you have to base your beliefs on certain presuppositions. And because presuppositionalists they don't really want to claim that all knowledge is based on faith. I don't know why they don't want this. I don't know why that's so.
Well, actually, this is what I was going to ask earlier. So when you say faith, you're talking about, like, I would just say, yes,
Unproven
I believe these
belief.
Things. Right, unproven belief.
Proven meaning you cannot logically prove them. You cannot deductively prove them.
Well, see, I have a little bit of an issue with that there, because I don't know if I could actually deductively prove like mathematics to you either if you were retarded, right?
But
So
assume I'm not retarded. I mean, sure.
But we don't know that. No, but
It's an open question.
but so when you're asking me about faith, it's like I believe these things to be true, but I suppose by faith you mean not
What do you mean by
certain
belief?
versus certain. Well,
Yeah.
so believe I'm talking about certainty, right? Versus you believe with faith versus belief with certainty. We believe the same things, right? But
Right. I
it's-
mean, do you think
claim
something will change
certainty.
for you when Christ comes back, or do you think that you are already in a position of your knees bowing, and it's only for the unbeliever that their epistemological position will change when Christ returns? Like you already have certainty. There's no reason to. Get,
I
like,
have certainty in Christ's return. Right, but do I have certainty about my own standings in the world?
Well,
and-
sure, that, but also just in Christ's return, are you saying that when Christ actually comes back, trumpets blazing, however that happens, I don't know the details, but when that happens, will there be anything added to your certainty, or are you just going to proceed at the same level of certainty?
Proceed at the same level of certainty. Like emotion, there might be an emotional response to it. Like I'm sure, but I actually don't have doubts in that.
Okay.
Like I mean, I'm not like, oh, maybe not. That's not where I am at now. Maybe I am just too retarded to have those doubts. But if it happened, I wouldn't be like, oh shoot, it is real.
Right. I mean, I get that. I guess I don't think that you can say. I don't know how you could say that that's not based on faith, as I've defined faith, as an unproven belief. Right? You can be as confident as you want. I think that's what Scripture gives us credence.
Well, but I don't know how
have, is
to
confidence.
prove it
But I don't think
to
confidence
you,
and certainty
though.
are the same thing.
Right. So for defining faith as unproven,
How do you
belief,
prove it to yourself?
Well, again, I would just go back to the this
The logic thing, but that
whiteboard
still
here.
requires you to
Right.
have certain assumptions. The assumption being that God is the necessary explainer of logic.
Well, it's kind of like I have certainty that 2 + 2 = 4. It's kind of difficult for me to explain that, like why I have certainty in that, but I do have certainty in that. Because I have certainty that 2 + 2
So
=
this-
4.
What you're just describing is why philosophy has been stuck in this loop for thousands of years. In my
Right. So
opinion, is
I actually do have trouble explaining it to you why I believe that is objectively true outside
well,
of
but
my
philosophers
own
will
mind.
say that is objectively true, and that we can know that certainty for some reason, and then they spend all their time trying to understand why do we know this to be true, and there are certain
right.
You
And
can
so,
put it in a certain category of knowledge. Whereas I'm a little bit more skeptical about even that, because I think that we can know that something that 2 + 2 = 4, but perhaps, but to know that that actually means anything still requires a certain amount of sense experience. Like, would you know that the statement 2 + 2 = 4 means anything if you didn't experience any life? If you never existed, right? Would 2 + 2 = 4? Well, I mean, I don't.
well,
maybe,
yes,
I
it
don't know.
still
It doesn't-
would. Right. So I believe after I
How do you know
die,
that?
2 +
How do
2
you know?
will still = 4.
How do you know that?
Well, how do I know if? Well, are you asking me if I didn't exist, how would I know? I wouldn't know anything because I did not exist.
Okay, sure, but how do you know now that when you stop to exist, 2 + 2 = 4?
Well, are you asking me, when I die, will I be transported to the funny dimension where 2 + 2 = 5?
Sure.
I mean, I would be. I don't have certainty in that belief. No.
Okay. All right. So then you don't have certainty in the eternality of numbers, except perhaps by definition, right? If you define one as being one, right? You might have certainty in the fact that A = A, which is essentially the same statement as 2 + 2 = 4. Although
Right.
Kant would probably disagree with that, but I don't quite understand Kant's argument. Kant would say that 5 + 7 = 12 is actually he would say a synthetic argument, not an analytic argument, meaning that somehow 12 contains something that 5 and 7 don't contain. There's actually something new being added. I don't really go with Kant on that. I'm not clear on why he thinks that, but forget that. I think what you're saying is essentially just A = A. You can be certain that A = A. When you say 2 + 2 = 4, that's basically what you mean, right?
Well, 2 + 2 is a logical reasoning that we can see actually exists. So I don't know how bogged down you want to get in that itself, but when you're asking me if I'm sure when I die, or like can I be sure of something that I'm not sure of?
4, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think that your certainty in 2 + 2 equaling 4 is based on your experience of the world. That's why you can even think the thoughts of 2 and 2 and 4. That's why those things mean anything to you. It's based on.
I agree with what you're saying, because yes, if I never existed, I could not know the things that I did not know. Right. It's like my 9-month-old child does not know that 2 + 2 = 4, but that doesn't change whether or not 2 + 2 actually equals 4.
So my point is
right.
The
and if I it's like if a child dies before they realize that 2 + 2 = 4, it doesn't change whether or not 2 + 2 actually equals 4. So it is not reliant upon your individual sense data.
Right. Now, so the way to get around your individual sense data, and this is the way philosophers do it, and it's actually a great trick, is basically they'll propose that there is that these things are true in the mind of God, right? They're not just true in your mind, but they're true in the mind of God, and that's why they have eternality. So, for instance, there was I think Berkeley I think Berkeley was a philosopher who was a rationalist, and so he believed that when you weren't looking, if there was no mind to grasp something, it did not exist. Things only existed in minds, period, in terms of his ontology. His existence, this is what pure rationalists believe, existence is only in the mind. But the way Berkeley got, he did believe, so before Berkeley, a rationalist would have to be like, well, if I walked out of the room and no one else was there in the room doesn't exist anymore. And that was, obviously not a very convincing argument. But what Berkeley said is, no. You're right. That would be the case, except for the fact that there is the mind of God, and he still sees the room. Therefore, that's why it maintains permanence. And so the mind of God is actually a really clever and really helpful philosophical technique that works to answer a lot of things.
Well, I think that's interesting because you could say that the universe itself is held together by God. So yes, if God were not there, the universe would not be there, right?
Right. John, did you see my private chat? There's someone who there's a guy that I don't know if he's still online, but that I've been going back and forth in the comment section of one of our videos on this topic, and I invited him to come on if he wants to, and he was asking for a link. So can you send that down?
This is the invite link. Well, actually, the invite link that I sent you guys is the same invite link. You can share that to other people.
Oh, okay, cool.
So, was he the which gentleman was that?
Let's see. Send an email to our regarding doubt. Dean, his email address. Yeah.
Well, don't say it online.
I'm not going to.
Did you just dox him? No. I can pull it up.
Okay. Yeah. Dean is the last name that he has in the email, or the first name.
Okay, I sent it to him.
What's the context behind this guy? I'm not filled in.
He says, send a link if I have a few minutes. I'd like to challenge you on the senses and accepting the scientific paradigm as a basis for knowledge. Thanks, Dean.
Which I'm not sure that I do in the way that he's referring to it, but this is a good... I'll try to lead into that because this is sort of where our conversation went. So I don't know exactly what he's assuming about what I believe, but I do think that, and this is going back to what we were just talking about, that ultimately... our acceptance of our postulates has to be based on our experience. That's what makes the difference between blind faith and strong faith. So if we're going to have any sort of a strong faith in our properly basic beliefs, then it must be experience. Experience is the only thing that can lend credence to our presuppositions. And so that does put me in... alignment with a lot of empiricists that or more these people that are just going off of scientific science is all I believe in or scientism, and that's certainly not what I believe, but because there's no basis for they don't really have any fundamental beliefs. But in terms of seeing our experience as being the necessary input for the induction nerds,
that allows us to accept certain presuppositions. That I absolutely do believe, and that's what I was saying in that video where I talked about geometry. Even geometry, right? You have Euclid; he comes along and he instantiates all these theorems, but all he was doing was proving them logically. Most of them, or a lot of them, were already figured out by the Babylonians years before, by other people, that they were being used without knowing why they were being used in a deductive sense, but they had already been discovered inductively. People had abstracted these principles, and then ultimately the 10 axioms that Euclid starts with, those are abstractions from experience, and that's my argument, is that all of our faith-based, properly basic beliefs are believed on the basis of induction and abstraction, which are synonymous. I'm not saying it's two different things, it's just one thing. You can call it either one, induction or abstraction, and that's what gives credence to our faith-based beliefs. Let's see, so one other important concept is the concept of particulars versus universals. So for instance, when we were talking about one, the number one is a universal. These are the end result of abstractions are universals, whereas conclusions reside at this particular level, and your postulates and your inductions resolve at your universal level. And so universals would include, any of the forms, right? The Platonic forms, like the concept of chair. Chairness, you might have a particular chair, that's a particular, but then the universal chairness, that's a form, it's a universal, it's a concept of chairness. But you get other things that are a little bit more abstract, like equality. How do you know that two things are equal if you don't have a concept of equality, this universal concept of what equality even means? Otherwise, how would you have a standard of equality, of saying these two things are equal, these two particular things are equal, if you don't have a form or an idea, a universal of equality? And so my point is that we do have these universals, but we get to these universals through a process of abstraction from the particular. And this is, Aristotle is basically with me on this. If you look at the famous painting of, if you look up Greek philosophers, I'm sure the first painting that pops up is the one where you've got Socrates, or I guess Plato, pointing to the sky, and then Aristotle pointing out. And the idea is, Plato is saying that truth in its highest sense, this is the rationalist position, resolves in the mind, or it resolves in the universal. And Aristotle didn't entirely disagree with him, but he was saying there is some connection between the universal and the particular, in a sense that the universal is an abstraction from all the particulars that we see, and that's where the universals come from. There's not some ultimate world of the forms, which Plato would have said, that where it's just sort of this abstract world that we can't prove, we can't really get into, that where all these forms exist, all these universals exist in truth, and then what we experience is just this abstract version.
Which is quite funny.
I think your mic input changed, John.
Oh, damn it!
I thought it was me.
No, it's John.
But the trick, what Augustine posed to kind of revitalize Platonism is said, there is this world of the forms, and it's the mind of God, right? That's where these things get their reality, is the mind of God. And there's a lot of truth in that, but then I think you still have to harmonize it with the Aristotelian view of, yes, but the incarnate is also real, right? What we experience in our tangible life, this is one of the key insights of Christianity, that is also reality. The body is real. The body, is not some evil. The material is not some evil thing. The material is part of reality. It is part of ultimate reality. I mean, I believe that in the new earth, it's going to be a material earth, right? When we die and become separated from our bodies, that is an unnatural state. The final state is going to be a much better state than our than the separation of our body and spirit. Our body, when we die and we go to heaven as spirits, that will be a better state than we're currently in this earth, only because of our proximity to God. In terms of just our ontology, it is better for us to be joined with our bodies. And that's why in the final state, at Christ's return, we will again get our bodies and be hylomorphic beings in the final end times.
Shall we continue on? Or are
Yes.
we waiting for the gentleman to join?
Yeah, we can keep going while we're waiting.
Okay.
It's about to be rude. I'm just saying that in the interrogation process here, I'm just looking for an account for not one thing, not a couple things, but a host of metaphysical and epistemological principles and categories that are necessary to have the structure that you said or seem to say exists in the world and not just in the brain. But what's the justification for believing in those things and the existence of these things? You did say, which anytime we hear the word existence, we're in the domain of metaphysics. And the reason I'm raising all these objections is because if you read somebody like David Hume, who's a consistent atheist, in you guys' camp, he pretty much calls you guys out in exactly what I'm doing. He's just going to say there is no justification for these things.
Right. So I would admit that there is no justification if you want to take it to the deepest level of logic, but that we have to assume some bedrock reality in order to function as living beings.
Okay, but now you're bringing in value judgments though. Like, well, why are we supposed to function? Maybe everything should degrade and devolve into the universe just collapsing. Like, why ought we to function and flourish? That's a value judgment.
Good question. I guess if I were pressed on that, I would say that I just want to.
Okay, but I mean again, I'm not trying to be rude. People think I'm being a dickhead when I say this. Has nothing to do with the debate. So that you want that is a taste preference, subjective. Okay, I want to eat ice cream here in a minute. I'm not being a douchebag. I'm just saying that I'm illustrating
No,
that it really has nothing to do with justified true beliefs, right?
Okay, so suppose I took as an alternative some argument for, well, you say that specifically Christianity must be true, not just theism. How would you establish that?
Well, because all of these transcendental categories that underlie any possible act of perception or predication, they need a specific type of metaphysics, a specific type of world, specific type of logic, epistemology, reasoning, ethics, and a specific kind of structure to the world. So it's not like any kind of God will work to just stick in there. We need a paradigm. So ultimately what's being argued for here is not just an abstract conception of some kind of mental deity or thing. It's actually an entire paradigm, an entire worldview of how the world's structured, how man is made in the image of God. So he has the ability to reason, he has the ability to use logic, which are invariant metaphysical principles that are out there operant in the world. And so he has an ethical dimension and domain to his being because he's made the image of God. So we have a basis for ethics. We have a basis for doing science because the future will be like the past precisely due to divine providence. I'm not saying it's true because I'm saying it. I'm saying that when you look at the paradigm as a whole, the things that we use to predicate these transcendental categories, they make sense and they're coherent and they are clearly there in the Christian paradigm. When we look at the other paradigms, atheism, materialism, radical skepticism, scientism, they can't give an account for logic, reason, demonstrating anything. They can't give an account for the various metaphysical things that we saw were needed for your claims and for your worldview. And so that's how I'm saying that the argument is an argument for our position because the other positions can't give an account for the things that they're using.
So why can't it be the case that a universe exists or was created through?
So then, James, in your position here, you kind of are taking the position that there just isn't an account for it, right?
No, I think there is. I mean, I think God is the best accounting for it. But it's an argument. It's a best possible.
So then the only thing
case
we're arguing about really is just certainty, right?
is whether it's certain. Yeah, absolutely.
Certain,
That
okay.
is the only thing we're arguing about. I think it is the best possible case. I think that it is a strong argument. I just don't think that it's certain, and I don't know why anyone can claim that it's certain. If they accept the definition of certainty and the definition of faith that I have, and I don't know why they would think that certainty is a biblical position based on the necessity of faith that seems pretty clear in Scripture and just based on our experience.
Okay, well, because you brought up Scripture, so do you think if you asked Jesus, it's like, can you have certainty in existence or in the nature of reality? Do you think he would tell you no or yes?
Well, Jesus absolutely can.
Well, no, but I'm asking if you asked him,
could.
can I have certainty
I
just
think
in
he
the
would say
nature
you
of
must
existence?
have faith. right? I mean, he said that over and over to his believers that they must have faith, and your faith has saved you. I mean, I think Christ would absolutely affirm the necessity of faith. I think he did over and over.
Well, but
I mean,
I'm not
said,
asking
if I raised
whether
from the dead, they wouldn't believe me. If I, he says in the parable when you've got the guy who is saying, "Hey, can I come back and warn my friends about hell?" And he says, "No, even if you."
Well, yeah, he says you have Moses and the prophets, and they didn't believe, so they won't
What
do.
is that if not an argument for the fact that we have to have faith?
I'm not saying that he didn't say faith was important or what you need. No, but I'm asking you, if you asked him specifically, can I be certain about anything? Do you think he would say no or yes?
I don't know what Jesus would say. I know that because it would totally depend on what on what you meant at the time by any of those words, right? Because the concept
I mean,
is something that wasn't even being discussed in the same
said,
terms at that time. But
if I said, can I believe that, like, the earth actually exists? Can I have a certain belief in this moment that the earth actually exists, that I am actually real? Do you think you would say yes or no?
Well, I mean, I guess I think he would say no. I don't know. Right? That's part of my my belief. But I guess he would say no. I think that you have to take that on.
Really
if
interesting.
If he understood.
Okay.
If he understood.
Yeah, because I think he would. This is totally just my own personal projection, but I find this whole argument to be silly. So like I feel like he would almost laugh or make fun of, like, I don't know. I don't want to project, but that's kind of what I would think. I would think he'd be like, why are you even asking me this question? What are you talking about?
I mean, he might say that.
Yeah.
To some degree, you don't have to worry about these things. You don't have to think about these things. You can have a perfectly valid faith and belief structure without ever encountering tag, without ever dealing with one of these.
Well, I mean,
arguments.
That goes for a lot of things, though,
and
right?
be totally justified, right? And this is. I mean, Plantinga is considered rather groundbreaking. He's a philosopher, modern day philosopher. I believe he's still alive. Rather groundbreaking. And I think Jay would agree with Plantinga on at least this, that God is a properly basic belief, and that you can be justified in your belief of God without ever having encountered one of these arguments. And so when we talk about justification, the requirements for justification, they call it reformed epistemology. There's a lot of crossover with presuppositionalism, but the reformed epistemology view is that absolutely we can be justified in our beliefs, even without having gone through a logic class, or even without having perfectly reasoned out the things. My point is, I think that where the presuppositionalists would go wrong is that they would say, yeah, but you can prove it. Even you don't have to, but you can. And I would say, no, you can't. Your proofs are either invalid, or they rest on certain presuppositions that must be accepted by faith, in which case they're still not totally proven. The properly basic things are still unproven by definition. That's what it means to be properly basic. It's unproven. And so why say that you can prove that God exists, even if you don't have to? I just think that that's an unnecessary, it's an unforced error, and it makes people not take presuppositionalists seriously.
Do you think you can have faith in certainty?
That seems like a contradiction in terms.
Okay. Like I can have a belief that certainty can exist?
I believe that certainty can exist. I mean, I believe that we will have certainty in the end state. So sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you can have faith in certainty.
Yeah.
Like an unproven belief that certainty can metaphysically exist.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
some means unknown to us, and then it just happens to give rise to a reality where you can ascribe numbers accurately, and there's rules of rationality that are true in this universe, and laws of physics are true in this universe, and we exist in this universe, and so on.
Because we need a specific type of God to string the pearls together, so to speak. So to just say that there's some God out there that has no direct connection to the world, like you mentioned, deism, that would not be a God who could sustain and keep in being every object and every relation between objects over time. So, for example, if you read St. Maximus, he has a really good essay about the logi, and one of the things in his logi doctrine is that he thinks that the divine ideas are the undergirding structure, fabric, and way that the world is constructed. It's like the fabric of how reality is constructed in the divine mind, and that's a perfect justification and providential way for reality to be guided, to be held.
I think I disagree with him.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, 2 + 2 = 5 in another universe with the different laws of physics. It's that simple. But you're still presupposing that it would adhere to its own laws of physics, and I do not think that any universe you can conceive in your mind could be illogical.
But why are I'm not necessarily sure that I disagree with you, but why would the possible universes be limited to the ones that you can conceive of?
Well, okay, well, let's say that it could be unbound, but you can't conceive of it. Right? Because there are things totally that I cannot comprehend, and that I believe that I cannot comprehend. Mm-hmm. That can still totally exist. But you're still saying that this other universe would adhere to its own laws of physics, right? And 2 + 2 = 5. That only exists in our world where these numbers exist, right? So if you're talking about some other theoretical universe that Jonathan cannot, and Jonathan meaning myself, not this commenter, can actually exist, maybe that's a thought experiment. But since you can't actually conceive of this world existing, it's
so presuppositionalists kind of disagree on. I think this is a point of contention to some degree, even within the presuppositional world, because basically there's the stance of the traditional presuppositional view. I believe this is Van Til's view. He's considered the father of presuppositionalism in a modern sense, anyway. Would be that logic comes from God, right? You have God, he creates logic. God is the reason why you have 2 + 2 = 4. And so it's not that God is beholden to 2 + 2 = 4. He could have made 2 + 2 = 5. That is the typical presuppositional view that I think Van Til would have espoused, which would agree with what Jonathan is saying.
Yeah, the other Jonathan.
Yeah.
Well,
I expect Jay would probably agree with that, but I don't know for sure.
Right, but we're still saying that other world would follow its own logical, whatever those logical, whatever the logic in that universe would be, that it would still follow those laws of physics, those laws of logic, right?
Sure.
So it would still just be alternative to our own, and then we're just kind of back to what we are currently at, even if it's outside of our understanding. And 2 + 2 = 5 would only make sense, like we're using words and numbers that
not necessarily.
We're
universe, not just talking about 4, 5 being the syllabic form of 4 in that world. We're talking about an actual difference in logic.
Correct, but it would still follow its own laws of logic.
Right.
So even if I grant that 2 + 2 = 5 in this other world, that still makes sense in that world.
Yeah, in that world it would make sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
This world with square circles.
Held together, etc. So there's a specific metaphysic that we have that the other worldviews like deism don't have. And what I'm saying is that when you adopt those positions, they end up in.
The question is, so when you say priori, I'm not sure what you mean by priori. I would think you're saying, normally when someone says priori, they're saying either a priori or a posteriori. So I guess you're meaning a priori, meaning without experience, we can know that 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of universe. And I mean, the question is how do you know that? And are those things, is logic something that flows out of God, or is logic something that God is beholden to? And that's an important question.
Well, I mean, that's like the silly question. Can
I think
God
it is a silly
create,
question.
Yeah. Can God create a burger too big for him to eat? And the answer is no, right? Because God actually is limited because he chooses to be limited in certain ways.
God can limit
right?
himself. So you're right, there are certain like linguistic tricks that we can come up with sentences that don't make sense, and then pretend that they make sense, but they still don't make sense. But to me, the whole logic beholden to God discussion, basically, I think it's clarified for me with a very simple analogy. I think that logic is to God's rationality what language is to the Word of God. Right? The Word of God is a perfect, meaning it's a tool. The Word of God is a tool to communicate God's meaning, but the language is imperfect, right? It's not a perfect way of encapsulating. I mean, words are just imperfect. They never quite, they're not fully understandable. We can't ever get the totality of the connotations that come with a word, and so that's why we have to interpret Scripture, because language is imperfect. And I think in the same way, logic, human rationality, is what I mean when I say logic, is to God's perfect logic what language is to the Word of God. Meaning, the Word of God is perfect and inspired and infallible, and God's rationality is perfect and infallible. And logic, as we conceive of it, is downstream of that. Human rationality is flawed. And the reason I know that is because 3 = 1 is the mathematical formula that we believe in when we talk about the Trinity, and that doesn't work logically. There is no way in any Christian, Nicene, Constantinople affirming Christian creed that logically makes sense of that statement. They all have to say it is mysterious, and just at the end throw their hands up in the air. They can try to explain parts of it, but they can never fully get there, and so they always end up ultimately saying human rationality can't suffice, and that's a key insight. And Van Til would have agreed with that. And that's where the whole question of which one is superior, logic or God, and the answer is God. But when you put it in the context of human rationality is to God's rationality is different from God's rationality, then I think it helps understand what we're actually talking about.
But that's an interesting thing too, because that's trying to actually comprehend the nature of God that might actually be outside of our bounds in our own understanding and language, right? Which is difficult to actually explain the nature of God. Does that make sense? Because we're limited, right, by our own language and by our own understanding, right? So to try and explain perfectly the divine using things like our own understanding of numbers and language and whatnot is...
So would you agree with this statement?
The law of non-contradiction will not allow 2 + 2 = 5, which is correct in
terms
our
of
own
human
universe.
rationality. The law of non-contradiction will also not allow the Trinity. It won't.
No, I would have to go against that, because that depends on what you mean by it. Because now we're going to have to define the Trinity, which is going to take us a very, very long time to get through.
It does. But when you separate human rationality from God's rationality and realize that there might be a difference, that there has to be a difference, that's when you get that, right? Because the law of non-contradiction is no two things can exist and not exist in the same way at the same time. And the big, and there might be one other qualifier, but basically, as long as you leave out one of those qualifiers, then it's okay. And so with the Trinity, you just say, well, it's not in the same way. That the 1 and the 3 they're both true, but they're not in the same way. But we don't know what that means. We don't know in what way they are the same, and we can't explain it. We don't get it. And so any way that we try to explain it in terms of human rationality, we will violate the law of non-contradiction. So that's why you have to separate human rationality from God's rationality, or you will end up violating the law of non-contradiction. At some point, you have to accept a tertium quid, a third thing that says, we accept it, but we don't get it. We can't make it work logically.
Yeah, because I've heard Jay and other people have to deal with that exact thing, and usually they do say something like Reformed Renegade says here that it's a category error.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but it's just dodging. I mean, it's just what I'm saying. They're just saying that not in the same way. I mean, I think that's what he means. Not in the same category. He's 1 and he's 3, but not in the same category. But ask them to explain what that means, and the Orthodox would be very quick to say it's a mystery, right? I mean, that is, the Orthodox are much quicker than
I think the Orthodox actually have like the hypostasis between the Trinity is explained in excruciating detail. Yep, sorry, I had that pop up. That wasn't. That's
What is
actually
that?
funny. That's
Why
from
was
the
it
other
good?
streams. That's actually funny. That's from the other stream. Somebody's I still have my pop-ups on apparently. My bad. Shoot, I lost my train of thought.
You were
So,
saying
yeah.
orthodoxy
So
explains
saying
the Trinity.
God is one, but also a Trinity. So I think what he's saying there is that the God is just a generic term. So God, in and of itself, does not entail a singular. I might be saying this incorrectly because God is just a generic term for divine being. So that does not contradict the idea of a Trinity being one God, because God is just a generic term. It's I believe that's how it's explained. I might be misremembering the argument there, and again, this is just an argument that I have heard, so I'm not like, this is not my personal argument. But
I don't think
yeah,
it's an argument
I know
that
it's
gets
called
around the
monarchical
13th quick. You're still gonna
Trinitarianism, but that would be a whole nother stream to have the Orthodox, because it's again, it's something that I've probably heard like 2 to 3 hours of debates and talks on, and it's very difficult to actually parse out. Like, it is not a simple topic. There are no less than 12 Trinitarian heresies in the first like 3 centuries of Christianity. So it is something that
Which
the church
valid
fathers
Christians
themselves.
believed in.
Well, there's the early church fathers, Trinitarian beliefs, they fought over, they changed, they came to a consensus, and eventually brought together what we have now. But it's always been there. Like, even from the Old Testament, you can argue the Trinity from many passages in the Old Testament. So I don't want to say it's like something that was created at Nicaea, right? Because that's not correct.
No.
But yeah, it is actually ironing out the fine details took a very long time, and a huge amount of people got it wrong along the way.
But it wasn't finalized. I mean, if you look at the term, so let's see, consubstantial, or let's see, what's I mean, consubstantial would be one. I'm thinking of another term. What's I mean, the filioque. There are several. There's one term in particular in the Nicene Creed that I'm blanking on, but basically, not generated, but
Spirated?
begotten. Yeah, spirated and begotten both are essentially tertium quids. You try to actually understand what that means. They're used because they're scriptural, but actually understanding exactly what that means, you'll get opinions on what that means, but it is not clear cut. Begotten, especially. I mean, what does it mean to beget something without creating it? In any normal sense of the word begotten, you're going to be talking about some form of creation or some form of coming into being. But that's not what we're talking about when you use the word begotten to refer to Christ. So that is a tertium quid. That is a concept that we've subbed in for this thing that we can't explain, right? And there are multiple terms like this in the Nicene Constantinople Creed. And that's one that's scriptural, right? We use it, and we use it validly. We use it with confidence because we see it in Scripture. But actually knowing what it means is another thing. And you try to carry the logic too far, you will get a contradiction, which is why we have to say that human rationality is not a one-to-one matchup with God's rationality. That's my view.
Well, I'm totally fine saying that, like, my grug brain cannot fully comprehend it or explain it to you. Like, I'm fine taking that position. I think that's reasonable. Because, I mean, what is it, one of Paul's letters where he says we see as if through a glass darkly?
Yeah.
Like, that sort of thing. So our understanding is limited, and I'm totally fine with accepting that on a lot of things. Now, other people can probably do a better job of explaining it than I can.
Absurdity. So in other words, it doesn't actually do us any good to admit deism, because deism wouldn't solve the problems, for example, of predication. So I need a God who has knowledge of all the facts.
Argument now he's going through the different worldviews, and he'll say this. I think this is the video where he says it in a second, where he's saying, the guy says, well, you you can disprove these particular arguments, but there's an infinite number of other arguments, and this is where Jay would say, no, there's just a certain number of worldviews that you can group all these bad arguments into, and you can reduce them to absurdity. And that's how the presuppositionalist apologetic goes. And it's a fine method. It just doesn't work for everyone, and presuppositionalists tend to be dogmatic in that apologetic. They tend to say that this is the only God-honoring way to go about apologetics. I don't know if Jay would say that or not, but that was sort of Van Til's position, and that is just foolish to me. I think that there are a number of different things that convince people, and people are totally justified in using whatever they think will convince the person that they're talking to across the table. If you want to use emotional arguments for why they should believe in God, that's totally fine. As long as you're not lying in what you're saying, there are all kinds of different reasons why people come to faith in terms of the psychology of conversion. And so I think presuppositional apologetics is a fine method. I think that reductio ad absurdum arguments are perfectly valid, and in many ways they can be the most valid. I think that this method works, right? Using tag and then saying that the only worldview that explains logic is the Christian worldview. I think that's a great argument, but it is still a faith-based argument. There are still faith-based presuppositions, and it is still an argument for the best possible explanation, which includes some amount of probability and uncertainty, meaning someone could still, in theory, come up with a better explanation, but in practice, every single bad explanation they come up with, you can reduce to absurdity. And so that's why you can always hold the high ground in terms of the apologetic. And if that's the method you want to do, that's great. But it's not going to be coercive. It doesn't force them to accept your position. And it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be compelling for some people.
Yeah, I was distracted because I needed to respond to this comment today.
Yeah,
these religious nut jobs can't even agree on one verse in the Bible. Citation needed, but want everyone to believe in their stupid sky daddy. The irony. Well, the irony, sir, is that if you believe to have any knowledge claims whatsoever, or if you believe in something like scientism, yet all of these scientists have differed throughout the entirety of human history on a variety of topics. In fact, I would suppose that most of your beliefs that you currently hold, you will not hold within the next 50 to 75 years, and most of them will be proven wrong, as they all have been in the past. So, I mean, you can go over the changing nature of science. You can't even repeat a lot of these papers and whatnot. You have a repeatability crisis in a lot of these quote-unquote peer-reviewed studies where they try and recreate them, and they simply can't. And also, I don't even grant the fact that arguing over the truth is a bad thing. We should all be arguing over what we believe in. So, yeah, it's just... Yeah. Part
we are
of
having
life,
my favorite
sir.
kind of conversation, which is when 3 people that agree on 90% of truth are arguing over the remaining 10%. Like, I think that's the most interesting type of conversation. Try getting 2 people that agree on basically nothing to talk, and it's so boring because they're just talking past each other.
That presupposes that, like, even whatever he would believe in as his higher power or as truth, whether it's scientism or the people he sees on TV, agree with each other, and they simply don't. Like, I'm not sure if you've ever watched something that's more your speed, like The View, but they don't always agree with each other either. I mean, I'm just saying.
Well, talk about a belief system that requires faith.
Oh, see, he immediately backs down. Oh, wait, no, you guys are held to a higher standard. Not me, though. Well, way to back off the claim once you got called out, Michael. Damn, that didn't take much. Jonathan says, as long as you don't indoctrinate the ideas / beliefs into your children. No. We all indoctrinate our own beliefs about morality and the world into our children. That is quite literally our job.
Yep.
Because guess what? If you're an atheist and you're a quote-unquote rationalist, you're going to try and impose your rationalist worldview upon your children. You don't leave them in a cardboard box and not teach them. That's child abuse. You try to teach them, your view of morality because that's what you think is right, which is exactly what Christians do as well. That is exactly what every people group does, unless you're lazy absentee fathers, which I imagine none of us here in the chat are. Of course not.
John, you're the only one here that's a dad, so.
Well, but I'm saying that's what we would do. And
Yeah.
that's just, what do you say? Don't indoctrinate your kids. It's like, what do you mean by that? Don't
Right.
teach them what you believe and pass down your value systems as every human and society has done for the entirety of human history. What are you talking about?
Yes, Logan says it well.
Yeah, minimum requirement. Yeah, that's basically it. That actually is, yes, the minimum requirement. Because the alternative is you're just not there.
I think it would be interesting in a future stream to do one on apologetics, because there are some there's like 5 basic approaches to apologetics, and there'd be a lot of crossover, but you have to talk about epistemology first. So I'm glad that we're having this stream, but I think at some point in the future it would be interesting to talk about the different
Well,
apologetics.
the epistemology is good, yeah, because this guy says your rebuttal conflates issues. Christianity impeded science for centuries. I would like to point you to who started the universities and who started the hospitals, the modern day hospital system.
And who funded science
It was
What did Isaac
it
Newton
was all
believe?
Christians. It was all Christians if you go back to it. So your entire scientific method and all of these people and institutions are based off of Christians and started by Christians. You like cell phones, buddy? You like talking on that black hole device? You're welcome, I guess.
But to be fair, it was to some degree a very specific group of Christians that did most of the scientific work, namely Protestants. Catholics.
Well,
were
they
a
did
little
start
bit
the
opposed.
the institutions. Although, to be fair, if you go back far enough, the Catholic Church, while they didn't like some research that was being done, they definitely did fund and have some great scholars throughout the early and Middle Ages, for sure. Now, you can always point out like specific issues. Oh, they didn't like this guy, they didn't like that guy, or whatnot. But that's everybody has their foibles, okay?
Catholics have always been critical of any kind of impartial thought, anything that was unbounded by Catholic views. Like, they would be totally happy to suppress. I mean, even to this day, many Catholics would be absolutely happy to suppress books if they thought that it would keep people from following bad ideas. I don't know, a lot of people are coming back around to that particular perspective, and there might be some validity within reason, but I do tend to follow the Protestant view that sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's better to talk about these things openly in a impartial way, and the truth will out. Catholics, even to this day, I think, are slower to say that kind of thing. Certainly, as an institution, they've been very
No, dude,
willing
book
to suppress.
burning is based, man. It's hella based.
Exactly.
Love it. Yep.
No, this guy thinks. Sorry, this is a Christian stream, not a Muslim stream. Sorry, wrong one.
No.
Flat Earth stream. True.
John, can you play the last link that I had in the Google Doc?
Okay, that is number 4.
It might be titled the same
Just
thing,
this one.
but it's a different video.
It's similar, yeah. Tag explained for slow boys. What 635?
No, play from the beginning.
Okay.
It's a short video.
Can we see that? X is the necessary condition of Y. Y, therefore X. Now, granted, I know that no atheist is going to accept that when I plug in God or the preconditions or anything like that.
So this is his tag argument, and he's explaining that it's not circular. Now, this is very interesting because Jay will also make the argument that all rationality or all logic is circular at the foundation level. So I don't know why he's dodging the circularity by trying to explain why his argument isn't circular, but he is correct. I mean, like I said, there are 2 different formulations of the tag argument. One is circular, one is not. This is the not circular version. That X is a necessary condition of Y, Y therefore X. In this case, if you plug in, he's saying there's a number of things you could plug in for X, but one example we've been talking about is logic. So logic is, God for X and then logic for Y. God is a necessary condition of logic. We have logic. If you can get someone to accept logic and the fact that God is a necessary condition of logic, then you can get someone to accept God. The problem is normally you can get someone to accept logic, but you can't necessarily get them to accept that God is a necessary condition of logic. I think that this is a perfectly it is a valid logical argument. The strength of the argument depends on your ability to convince someone that God is a necessary condition of logic. And I think that is a strong argument. It might not be a coercive argument. It's not always a compelling argument, but it certainly can be. But once you've shown this, you still haven't proved anything. You've just gotten someone to accept by faith the presupposition that God is a necessary condition of logic.
But the structure of the argument is not, my argument is God exists, therefore God exists. Okay, do you see that anywhere in that? Did I ever say, I know God exists because God exists. I presuppose God, therefore God exists. Do you see that in it? Is that the same as this? No, it's not. There's nothing, it should be self-evident in a way. I don't believe in self-evident truths, but in a limited sense, right? It should be obvious to any reasonable person that this is not a fallacy. If X is a necessary condition of Y, and if Y is the case, then clearly, by necessity, X is the case. It's very simple. Okay, it's not rocket science. I know people get confused over transcendental arguments. They think this is some wild, obtuse, out there thing. It's actually really simple. What's Father Deacon's analogy he always makes? Cake.
John, do you mind putting in the chat the same poll that I put out at the beginning? I'm curious if people
if it changes.
better. Yeah. We had about 40% say they do understand it and 60% say they don't.
Oh, wrong button. Here, I'll let this play while I put that in there.
Right. What are the necessary conditions of having a cake? Flour, eggs, sugar, icing. Okay. I have a cake. If I have a cake, then by necessity, I have the necessary conditions of cake: flour, icing, eggs, milk, whatever. I don't know. Whatever makes a cake. I don't know. I don't need that soy Pillsbury Doughboy diet that old John Lennox is over there eating. Okay. I eat the carnivore diet. But if I did eat cakes, then by necessity, the cake would include the necessary elements of cake to have cakeness, namely flour, eggs, milk, sugar, etc., etc., etc. To quote Bernardo from West Side Story. So, do you guys see this? Because I just want a little minute to rant there about the bottom of the barrel IQ stuff going on in the atheist comment sections, because there's probably at least 400 or 500 atheists in Matt Dillahunty's comment section on our debate and underneath my debate on my channel with him. They're literally saying, this guy thinks that saying God exists is the argument for God's existence. And they literally think that saying a transcendental argument is word salad. Okay, this is not word salad. This is very simple.
Pause it. So let me share my screen. So let me just show you a couple different versions of the transcendental argument. So this is so the other term that you'll hear is the ontological argument. Here, let me light my cigar real quick. So you can read through the propositions here. This isn't an article that is not yet ready to be published, but it's one I've been working on for several months now, explaining a lot of what I've said in more technical language, although it's still not really written for a technical audience. Which is one of the challenges I'm trying to figure out, is how to write this, who the audience is. I've written it in more of a C.S. Lewis way, where I'm trying to explain complicated things in very simple terms, because that's how I think. I'm not a particularly academic mind, and so but I have thought about these things deeply. So anyways, that's what this is. But so this is the ontological argument as explained by Descartes, which is he presents it differently than Anselm does, and some would say that he presents it in a different way that totally changes the argument. I'm not convinced of that. I think that this is basically the argument that Anselm makes, with one big exception that I'll explain in a second. But the argument essentially is, if God is, if there is a God, it is a perfect being, right? Which is a definition. So you just defined the God that you're talking about. A perfect being possesses all perfections by definition. And then existence is a perfection. That's a postulate. So you have to accept that. And then God is God necessarily possesses the quality of existence when you combine statements 1 through 3. Therefore, God exists. So the postulate that this argument rests on in the Descartes formulation is that existence is a perfection. And I love this formulation of the argument because it actually perfectly condenses the ultimate question. Existence versus non-existence. Do you prefer existence or non-existence? If you think existence is a good, meaning it's one of the perfections, then you're on the right side. I mean, this is the question that God puts to the Jews in Deuteronomy. He says, choose life or choose death. Choose life. Please choose life. It's crazy. You have the creator of the universe pleading with the Jews, like, choose life. Follow me. Follow the laws that I'm setting out here. And this is the difference between nihilism and a valid worldview. Well, I take it back. Nihilism is a valid worldview. It's nihilism and a true worldview, and a worth living worldview is existence or non-existence. Nihilism is the belief in nothing, that nothing is better than something. This is also essential in terms of some of the other arguments for God, in terms of why is there anything? Is existence better than non-existence? So I like this argument, but stated in this way, it still depends on a postulate that must be accepted by faith, namely that existence is a good or is a perfection. And that is still, like all postulates, a faith-based assumption, just by definition of what a postulate is. The way Anselm would have said it is, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And that's a fine way of saying it as well. But then even as Anselm argues it, he gets down to explaining how existence would be one of those perfections. And it works. The ontological argument works, but usually by the end of it, after having explained it, you will leave people feeling hoodwinked. They'll feel like, yeah, I feel like you cheated somewhere in there, but I'm not sure exactly where. And I think that when you really parse it out, you do get some version that looks like this, where you have to admit that existence as a perfection is a postulate, in which case you're no longer circular, but you still have something that you have to accept a priori, or you have something that you have to accept by faith. Not really a priori, but you have to accept it by faith. And I think this is an easy choice. If I had to choose between existence and non-existence, I choose existence every single time. And so I think this is a great argument if you are willing to argue at that level of the fact that existence is better than non-existence. I don't know. What do you guys think about that argument?
I've never heard it before, so I don't. To be perfectly honest, I don't totally understand it, and I think from the tag perspective, it makes, I guess, more sense to my mind. But again, this is the first time I've heard of it in this way. Like, so I don't even know necessarily what the postulate existence is perfection really means. So in this case,
the way Anselm would have started is that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, in other words, God is the greatest possible thing that you can conceive of. And if you're thinking of, some dude in the sky who doesn't exist, then, well, wait a second, you're not thinking about God. You're thinking about some dude in the sky who doesn't exist. You're not think of something greater than that, right? It doesn't matter. Forget the Bible. Forget our conception of God. Think of the greatest possible thing. All right, now you're thinking of the greatest possible thing. Wouldn't it be better if that thing existed? That would be even better than this thing that you're thinking of that doesn't exist, right? That's worse than this great thing that you're thinking of that does exist. Now, if you're not thinking of the greatest possible thing, then think of something greater than that, because that's the greatest possible thing. And, we call that God, just by definition, but it's the greatest possible thing. Think of the greatest possible thing. The criticism of this argument is, well, wait a second, aren't you just saying that if you can think of something, then it exists, right? Isn't that sort of the format of the argument? And it's not. That argument that critique doesn't really pan out. Like even back in Anselm's day, there was a guy who came up with an argument and said, well, if I conceive of the greatest possible island, therefore that island exists. And he tried to formulate his argument in the exact same way that Anselm presented it. And that is a category error. You're not conceiving of the greatest possible thing. You're conceiving of the greatest possible island, and that island doesn't have to exist because it's you're talking about a thing. I'm talking about the greatest possible thing, period. You're talking about an island, the greatest possible island. That's not the greatest possible thing. I'm talking about the greatest possible thing, period. Thing qua thing, to use the British terminology. It's like thing as a thing. The greatest possible one certainly would include existence. It's got to exist. It would be better if it existed than it didn't exist. Therefore, if it is the greatest possible thing truly, then it must exist. That's the argument. Like I said, it's not very compelling to a lot of people because they just feel like, what? You're just thinking God into existence and saying that you've proved God? Which is why Anselm's way of presenting it was never as an argument to an atheist to prove God's existence. Anselm presented this argument in the form of a prayer and he titled the prayer Faith Seeking Understanding. So you already have faith in God. This is just a way of confirming the faith that you already have, which I'm totally okay with, right? That is what I'm saying you have to do. And so this argument doesn't work to prove God in a purely logical way. It either relies on this postulate of existence being a perfection, which you can either take or leave, right? And still be totally valid in your logic. One would lead you to nihilism, totally valid, but wrong, in my view. And then the other would lead you to God. So it's great. So I like the fact that it centralizes the error, which is why logic is great. It condenses where you might be wrong on a few basic things. But as an argument, as a coercive argument for God, it doesn't work. But it was never intended that way. And Descartes, the problem with the way Descartes was trying to use the argument was to coercively prove God a priori. He was trying to prove God purely using logic, and that's where it fails, because you don't prove anything here. You still have to rely on a faith-based assumption about existence. And so it doesn't work to prove God, but it does work as a confirming proof for why you should believe in God, because existence is in fact better than non-existence. Did that help at all, or is it still really confusing?
Well, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying here, but yeah, I would just have to mull it over more before I find that like a convincing argument to use on somebody for some reason. So I'd be happy to read your full article.
This is not very different from tag. I mean, tag is just a version of this, or maybe this is a version of tag, I should say. The ontological argument is a form of a transcendental argument. The other common type of argument for God, my keyboard isn't working. There we go. Would be the argument. That's freezing on me. Let's see, are you guys seeing my screen scroll?
Yeah, we see it. We see it.
So this is the other argument, the argument from cause and effect, or the argument from motion. There's a bunch of different ways of formulating this, but really they all come down to basically the same thing. And when you write it out in propositional form, you get every cause has an effect. The chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. Therefore, we must. So both those things have to be accepted by faith. Those are both postulates. They're reasonable postulates. I certainly accept them, but they are still based on faith. They're based on our experience of the world. It seems like every cause has an effect, and it seems like the chain of cause. Sure, well, it seems reasonable to assume that it's not an infinite chain of cause and effect, but that is the crux. Proposition 2 is really the big question here. But then Proposition 3 is a combining of statements 1 and 2. Therefore, there must be an effect which caused itself, and we can call this ultimate self-causing effect God. And really, if you restate this, it does. If you're trying to do it deductively, purely deductively, then you get circular reasoning, which is the way I have it in the second formation in statements 1 through 5 here. Define God as a self-causing effect. Every cause has an effect. The chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. Therefore, there must be an effect which caused itself. Since God is a self-causing effect, God exists. But really, statement 1 and statement 5 are the same thing. Your definition is your conclusion. Therefore, you have reasoned in a circle. You have assumed your conclusion. it's not a valid logical argument. But this particular argument for God, it was never intended to be purely logical. It requires the acceptance of a couple basic postulates: that every cause has an effect, and that the chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. And so that statement number 2 is the crux of it, because you could either assume that there is an infinite chain of effect, like the universe has always existed, and the chain of cause and effect just goes infinitely far back. There is no unmoved mover, it's just motion. Or you can assume that at some point you got to break that chain. And I'm not convinced that there's really a way to I think you just have to take one or the other on faith, that there's either an infinite regress of cause and effect, or that there is an unmoved mover, as Aristotle would have said. I think that the unmoved mover makes more sense, but I really have to just take that on faith. I can't prove that deductively.
No, I've heard the unmoved mover phrase before, but basically, like, things are in motion, something must have set them in motion. If things can't be infinite,
unmoved mover, they're the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to cover this because these are some of the classic arguments.
Yeah, number 2, Atheism Socrates is invalid. But yeah, the chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. I think you can grant that postulate, though, because even like in our understanding of physics, things can't have an infinite set of cause and effect, right? Because you're always going to have some sort of degradation according to the first law. First law of thermodynamics, that is, right?
Isn't the second one about degradation?
This is the second one? Whichever one that it is, right? Like, if you push a boulder down a hill, it'll have cause and effect, but it can't be infinite. Like, that effect will eventually just turn to zero at some point. Right? Am I crazy about that?
I mean, I think you're right, but I don't know that proves... what does that say about number 2, that statement 2?
Well, so he's saying that can't be. But I'm just saying, surely that can be logically possible, that a chain of cause and effect cannot be infinite. Unless you can point to some infinite chain of cause and effect. Because he's disagreeing with it.
You're not going to be able to experientially point to it without having existed infinitely in the past.
Well, right, but that's what I'm saying, is he's saying he disagrees with it, so I'm just trying to run through with it.
Yeah, I don't think you can prove one way or the other. Yeah, I don't think it's invalid. I think you're right. So one other thing I want to point to a reference from this article is there's a lot of good stuff here. One thing is this diagram right here. So this is what I was explaining earlier in terms of, this is my theory of rationality. In terms of all rational knowledge that we have. Now, let me take one step back real quick and describe 3 types of knowledge in my theory of knowledge. I think that we have knowledge, there's rational knowledge, which is described by this diagram, and I'll get to in a second. There is also what I call knowledge by acquaintance. So this is knowledge that is purely the sense data. I think it's fair to call that a knowledge in a sense, but it doesn't have to interact with your rationality. So let's say you touch a hot stove, you experience pain. You could even say that you know pain, you know that feeling, like your sense data gets it and it passes it on to your brain. That, I think that's a type of knowledge. I think that's fair to call it that. Then there is the rational knowledge that we have. Again, I'll explain that in a second. And then there's a third kind of knowledge, which is actually a lot harder to understand. It's a lot harder to know how it works. And this I call innate knowledge. So any knowledge that we have pre-birth, that is baked in at birth, any knowledge that we start this life with, or at least start, our conscious life with, is innate. And by virtue of being innate, we don't have any way to inspect it prior to birth, right? You don't get to do any tests on a baby before they're born, and so you really have no way of understanding or fully knowing how they get that knowledge. You can do certain biological tests and scientific tests to start to understand some aspects of that knowledge, but we really can't fully know how we get knowledge, why we are not a blank slate, a tabula rasa. And so innate knowledge is something of a mystery, I would say, or at least it's we can't really penetrate it. I believe that innate knowledge, however it's done, it might be done through naturalistic means, but I believe it's knowledge that God has given us to start our lives with. There are certain things like a belief in ourself, like a belief in the external world as being a reality. I think those things are baked into us innately, most likely. Don't necessarily require experience to know, but it is basically impossible to tell exactly what amount of knowledge we get from experience and what amount of knowledge we already had coming out of the womb. Anyways, so we have knowledge by acquaintance, just the raw sense data, the innate knowledge, and then the rational knowledge is all knowledge that we acquire. So all learned knowledge is rational knowledge, all knowledge that we acquire after birth. And that knowledge, I believe, goes through this process of experience, followed by induction. We abstract from our experience. So we take the raw sense data, we formulate inductions, right? We see the ball rolling out of the pipe every 30 seconds, and we assume that the ball is always going to roll the pipe, or to use an infant, the baby cries. It somehow knows to cry, right? That's innate knowledge. It cries, it gets milk, and then it thinks, okay, wait, maybe there was a connection between the crying and the milk, cries again, gets milk again. Now all of a sudden it has two experiences that it can start to abstract from and think, okay, crying produces milk, or crying will allow me to get milk. And it does that enough times, and then it starts to realize that not every single time I cry do I get milk. So now it has to reformulate its induction. It's got to put it back through this process of rationality, and realize that sometimes I cry, I get milk, sometimes I cry, I get other things, or whatever. So anyways, that your experiences, you abstract to form postulates. So a very simple postulate could be, when I cry, I get milk. So that's a postulate, and with a very simple conclusion. When I cry, conclusion, I get milk. Now, eventually, that's going to be challenged pretty quickly, because sometimes it'll cry and won't get milk. So now it has to reassess its experience. And so that's where the circle goes back around. Your postulates lead to your conclusions through deduction, and then those conclusions inform your experiences and are informed by your experiences through a process of continuing the induction with new information from the conclusions. And so it does work in a circle, but this type of circularity is not, this is not fallacious, because a fallacious circle would be between the postulate and the conclusion, a circle that only included postulates and conclusions. That's assuming the conclusion. But as soon as you include experiences in the mix, you are not talking about a fallacious circle. That is a totally valid circle. It's what we would call a synthetic circle, if you use the Kantian phrase, because now you are actually getting new information, experiential information, into the system through your experiences. And so my view of knowledge, I think that knowledge starts with the first postulate. So, rational knowledge, I should say. Rational knowledge starts with the first postulate. So you experience things. You have that knowledge by acquaintance. You form the first postulate. That's your first bit of rational knowledge, is your first postulate. And it might be wrong. So I think knowledge can be wrong. You can know things that just aren't true. But then you start to, you test it by experience, and you start to critique that knowledge, and you form conclusions that are more and more true. And eventually, once you start to get older and you actually start to develop your rationality, you can start to form some truly properly basic postulates that are true in every case, right? My belief in God cannot be disproven. There is no experience that could possibly disprove my belief in God. Unlike with the ball rolling out of a pipe, it would only take one red ball rolling out of the pipe to disprove my belief that a blue ball rolls out of the pipe every 30 seconds. So in terms of truly properly basic beliefs, those are beliefs that can never be disproven by experience. And whereas every other postulate that you think is properly basic, if it eventually gets disproven by experience or confirmed to be false, then you have to reassess it. So it's a continual spiral. You build on your conclusions, feed into your experiences, feeding back into your postulates, feeding back into your conclusions, and it keeps going, and you spiral, gaining more and more knowledge as a spiral continues. But this is my theory of how rationality works. But in terms of rational knowledge, I think it starts with your first postulate, meaning it starts with faith, because postulate is when you accept something by faith. You accept it without proof, but you just accept it on the basis of your experience. And that's my theory.
Well, at the risk of being a Johnny Downer over here, we're nearly 3 hours in.
Yeah.
So I honestly don't think we're going to get to much more on this, and I don't think there's much value now, considering anything we say past this point almost certainly won't be viewed by anyone ever. This will be our own little secret Gnostic knowledge that no one else will ever have access to on the internet. Except for the 25 people here with us right now, we're probably the only people to ever hear any of this. So James' secret Gnostic esoteric wisdom will only be for you elect here, and you only for all of eternity.
Well, we don't want that for sure. I'm impressed that we have 24 people still here. I've been looking at my screen the whole time.
They're mainly just arguing with each other in the comments.
Yeah, this is fun.
Fair enough. Well, there you go. Any thoughts on what I've presented here?
I have never looked into this at all, and it is a lot to take in. So, I mean, like somebody said earlier, do you need this in order to grow in your Christian faith? No, not necessarily. I don't think. Maybe to make people believe in God, maybe, yeah. I don't know, but I've never had a need for it personally. It's definitely interesting, but yeah. Very, very esoteric knowledge.
Came in just for the secret knowledge.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so this, just to kind of close out some of the thoughts that we've been tugging at here, you can see the universal and the particular here as well, right? The particular is going to be at the experience and conclusion level. The universal is going to be at the postulate level. This is my argument against the circularity in presuppositionalism, which is my biggest issue with presuppositionalism. Otherwise, I agree with them. I agree with the presuppositions of presuppositionalism. I just don't agree with how they argue for presuppositionalism as an apologetic. I don't agree with the way that they justify using what they will admittedly call a circular form of reasoning. My argument is no, it doesn't need to be circular. This is the correct circle, and this is not a fallacious circle. Whereas they will actually espouse a fallacious circle, which just is taking place in the postulate conclusion zone, and they'll call that valid. They'll say it's valid because ultimately all reasoning at the foundational level is circular. To me, it's just a misnomer. They're trying to argue for why they have certain assumptions, and they're doing so on the basis of assuming the conclusion. It's like, no, just assume the assumptions and admit that that's what you're doing. You are assuming the assumptions. That's fine. Everyone can assume assumptions. Everyone has to. Don't call them conclusions. Admit that they're assumptions and then move on, because that's the only way to have knowledge, is to have certain assumptions and then grow in your knowledge from there. So that's my critique of presuppositionalism. And I think once you start to include the experiential side of things and the induction into your rational process, it all starts to fall into place and it all makes sense. And if presuppositionalists would adopt this type of epistemology, then I think presuppositionalism would be the most valid form of epistemology. But because presuppositionalism, which has a lot going for it, argues for itself in a circular fashion, it gets discounted by a lot of serious philosophers, and validly so. They're just not making their case well. So I have a serious desire to improve their standing amongst serious thinkers. So that's the heart behind all this. I don't know how I've done that, but that's the argument. And I'm very grateful for all the people that have followed us this far and tuned in. So, thank you.
All right. Have a good night, gentlemen. Appreciate y'all hanging out.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. See you guys.